Good evening, dear friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Perhaps you've had a long day, and now you're looking for something calm, steady, and comforting to ease you toward rest. You've come to the right place. Tonight, we'll travel back to the summer of 1944, not to follow generals or maps, not to hear gunfire and battles, but to sit quietly with the men who drove the trucks. Without them, armies would have stood still. With them, history rolled forward mile after mile. If you find comfort in these gentle stories, you might consider giving a quiet like or a soft subscribe. It helps me keep bringing these bedtime journeys to you. And, if you wish, you can share where you're listening from, whether it's late night in Kansas, an early dawn in New England, or perhaps somewhere far across the ocean. I'm always amazed to think of us connected in these quiet hours. So let's dim the lights. Let the hum of the fan or the soft crackle of the fireplace keep us company. Pull a blanket over your shoulders and open the window just enough to feel the cool night breeze. This will be a calm journey meant to soothe and to steady. And now, let us begin with part 1. Longings whispered in the dark of a damp tent. The night before the road began was never truly silent. Even in the stillness of the camp, with the canvas tents pressed low against the drizzle, small sounds carried. The cough of a soldier, the drip of rain from the eaves, the soft shuffle of boots on mud. And beneath those sounds, deeper still, were the thoughts every man carried but rarely spoke aloud. 19-year-old James Wilson lay in his narrow cot, staring at the faint outline of canvas above. Back home in Cleveland, his bed had been softer, sheets laundered by his mother, windows creaking with the sound of streetcars in the distance. Here, there was only wool that scratched against his chin and socks damp with rain. He kept his longings hidden, the way most soldiers did. But they were there. Quiet wishes, whispered not to others, but to himself in the moments before sleep. He wished for the smell of his uncle's filling station, the gasoline sharp and familiar, mixed with the faint sweetness of chocolate bars sold at the counter. He wished for the taste of his mother's cornbread, warm and buttered, something no powdered army ration could imitate. And he wished, perhaps most of all, that he might return to those ordinary things one day, whole and unbroken. Letters were his lifeline. Folded carefully in his duffel were pages written in a careful hand, sometimes smudged with his mother's cooking flour, sometimes with the hurried script of his younger sister. They carried ordinary words, complaints about neighbors, notes about the dog, a reminder to stay warm. That felt extraordinary when read by candlelight. Each word was a thread tying him to a place where rain was just weather, not another obstacle between truck and road. The army rarely asked men what they longed for. It measured them by miles driven, cargo delivered, hours without sleep. Yet, even here, on the edge of the largest invasion in history, those longings kept men human. They made the difference between another anonymous driver and a boy who once leaned against a pump handle, dreaming of the wider world. Sometimes, at night, James would listen to the breathing of the men around him. In the darkness, he imagined he could tell what each man dreamed. One turned in his sleep, murmuring the name of a girl. Another snored heavily, the sound broken, like a man who carried weariness too deep for silence. Even the sergeant in the next tent, stern and sharp by day, sometimes whistled a tune under his breath before sleep, as though calling back a melody from home. These wishes were fragile, easily brushed aside by the rumble of trucks or the bark of an officer. But they lived on, and, in their quiet way, they gave shape to what would become the Red Ball Express. For the war was not only about movements on maps, it was also about the small, private hopes of men who wanted something more than victory. They wanted the chance to live and to return. That night, as drizzle thickened into steady rain, James closed his eyes. He pictured a porch swing back home, rocking gently under the weight of summer air. He imagined the laughter of neighbors drifting through open windows. He let himself drift into that world, even as engines idled in the distance, waiting for dawn. Morning begins with gray light and heavy boots. The first sound was always the whistle. It cut through the early dawn, like a blade through cloth, not shrill enough to alarm, but sharp enough that no man could mistake its meaning. James Wilson stirred under the rough blanket, eyes opening to a faint gray glow seeping through the seams of canvas. For a long moment, he did not move. He listened instead, to the drip of last night's rain rolling from tent to mud, to the muffled grumble of men groaning awake, to the low sigh of wind that always smelled faintly of fuel and damp earth. Boots scuffed against the ground outside. A sergeant's voice, practiced in carrying, called names one after another, though no one needed reminding. The ritual was the same each day. Rise, wash if water could be found, eat what passed for breakfast, and be ready for orders before the trucks stirred awake. The life of the Transportation Corps was measured not in grand speeches, but in these small, repeating tasks. James rolled from his cot, planting his feet directly into the shallow puddle that had collected on the tent floor. Cold water seeped instantly through the thin wool socks, but he only winced quietly. Complaints changed nothing. Around him, other men did the same, movements awkward in the cramped space. A cough here, a muttered curse there, the tired rustle of uniforms pulled over damp undershirts. Soldiers learned quickly not to expect comfort, only routine. He bent to lace his boots. Leather, still darkened from yesterday's march through wet ground. The laces felt stiff with mud, but his fingers moved by habit. Each knot tied was a reminder. Another day begun, another road waiting. The army did not grant the luxury of asking whether a man was ready. It simply declared the hour, and the man followed. Outside, the air was thick with the smell of damp canvas, machine oil, and smoke from cooking fires that had never truly gone out. A row of tents stretched into the mist, each identical, each harboring its share of restless dreams. The ground squelched under every step, sucking at boots with a sound like reluctant sighs. Rain had its way here, softening everything until even wood planks bowed under weight. The mess line had already formed. James joined it, falling into the rhythm of men who barely spoke, their thoughts still wrapped in half-sleep. Ahead, the cook ladled out spoonfuls of scrambled powder, eggs in name only, and coffee so black it gleamed like oil. Steam rose in pale ribbons, a comfort despite the bitterness. He accepted his tray with a nod, shuffling forward to the makeshift tables where men ate standing, balancing tin plates on one hand. The food was coarse, but it filled the hollow in his stomach. He chewed slowly, tasting more of tin than of egg, but letting the warmth spread through his chest. Around him, conversation began to stir. Talk of home, talk of weather, talk of trucks that had been stubborn yesterday and might be worse today. Always trucks. For drivers, machines became companions, burdens, and sometimes enemies, but never ignored. James lifted the cup of coffee, holding it near his lips to breathe in the bitter steam before sipping. The liquid burned, yet the burn was welcome. It pushed away the last threads of sleep and reminded him that he was, for now, awake, part of the great machine that was moving unseen through Europe. He looked across the tables and caught sight of Davis, already halfway through his meal, eyes heavy but determined. A nod passed between them, silent agreement that the day would go on, as all days did. After breakfast, the men drifted toward the motor pool. The camp shifted from stillness to motion, boots trampling, officers barking, engines coughing alive one by one. Olive drab shapes emerged through mist, trucks lined in precise rows like beasts waiting to be harnessed. The white stars on their hoods gleamed faintly, wet with dew, symbols both ordinary and immense. Each vehicle carried within it the possibility of victory or failure, depending on whether its wheels turned. Sergeant Harris stood near the line, arms folded, cap pulled low. His voice carried above the engines, a reminder that these trucks were more than machines. They were lifelines, arteries through which the Army's strength flowed. No bullets reached the front without them. No tank advanced more than a mile without the fuel they carried. He did not waste words on praise, only on duty, and yet the meaning was clear. Without drivers, the war did not move. James walked among the trucks, boots crunching on gravel, eyes searching for the one that bore his number, 4077. Even at rest, the Jimmy looked alive. Its hood glistened with rain, its tires caked with yesterday's mud. He ran a hand along the fender, feeling the rough texture of paint, chipped already despite its youth. This was his partner, for however long it lasted. He would learn its every sound, its quirks, its weaknesses, trusting it was not optional. It was survival. The morning air held a chill that seeped through his jacket, but sweat already began at the back of his neck as he checked the truck. Oil level, fuel, fan belt tightness, routine again. Each step ticked off like prayer beads, repeated until second nature. In war, it was the smallest oversight that could strand a man miles from safety, and so routine became salvation. Engines roared louder now, exhaust curling into the gray sky. The convoy would soon move, though no one said exactly when. Secrecy wrapped everything, from destinations to cargo. A driver's job was not to question, but to deliver. Still, curiosity lingered in every man's mind. Where today? How close to the front? Would the roads be passable? Or would mud swallow tires whole? James climbed into the cab, the seat hard against his back, the steering wheel vast beneath his hands. He pressed the starter, and the inline six coughed before catching, rumbling steady as if clearing its throat after sleep. The vibration traveled through the frame into his chest, a steady reminder that soon the road would call. He exhaled slowly, letting the hum settle into his bones. Around him, other drivers did the same. Rows of trucks grumbled awake, the sound blending into one long note, heavy and low. Men leaned from cabs to speak to neighbors, voices raised to be heard over engines. Some joked, though laughter was quick and quiet. Others simply stared ahead, eyes on nothing, conserving strength for the hours ahead. The sun remained hidden, the sky a pale smear of gray, as though reluctant to rise. Yet rise it did, and with it the day unfolded, another link in the chain of countless mornings that made up the Red Ball Express. Not a morning of glory, but of damp boots, bitter coffee, and the promise of long roads. A morning that asked nothing more of a man than that he rise and drive. In time, whistles blew again, this time shorter, sharper. Convoys began to roll, wheels grinding against mud and gravel. The great machine of war shifted forward another inch. James gripped the wheel, eyes narrowing at the road ahead, shoulders settling into the familiar weight of duty. Whatever longings had filled the night, whatever dreams had softened his heart, the morning called him to rise. And so he did. The trucks moved out in line, one after another, their engines merging into a chorus that echoed across the wet fields. Somewhere ahead lay danger, perhaps death. But here, now, there was only the sound of rubber on road, steel in motion, and the steady beat of men doing what was asked. Mud clings as trucks line up for duty. The rain had not left in the night. It lingered, steady and soft, like a hand pressing gently over the camp, smoothing every edge into gray. By the time James Wilson stepped from the mess tent, the ground was already yielding, boots sinking with each step into the thick paste of Normandy mud. It clung with a stubbornness all its own, as though the very earth wished to hold them in place. Mud was a constant enemy, silent and patient. It crept into every crease of leather, found its way into engines, and caked along the wheels until each truck groaned with the effort of turning. No man spoke of conquering mud. They endured it, cursing softly when it swallowed boots or sucked at tires. Even sergeants with hard voices could not shout it away. Mud had the patience of stone. James pulled his jacket tighter against the damp air, his eyes on the line of trucks that stretched across the motor pool. Even in mist, they seemed immense, hulking shapes of olive drab, lined like soldiers themselves, each bearing the white star that marked them as part of a cause larger than any one man. The smell here was sharper than in camp: oil, gasoline, hot metal cooling from yesterday's run. It mixed with the earthy weight of mud and the sour tang of wet canvas, forming a perfume that would forever mean war. The motor pool was alive with motion. Drivers moved between trucks, stooping low to check tires, peering under hoods, tightening belts with chilled fingers. Some muttered to themselves, counting off steps in routine. Others worked in pairs, one man holding a lantern while another checked beneath a chassis. Mechanics, already streaked with grease, darted from truck to truck, their voices rough but steady, like blacksmiths in an endless forge. James found his own place in the line, truck 4077, waiting like a sullen beast. Rain beaded along its hood, running down in rivulets that carried dust away, but left streaks of grime behind. He ran a palm over the metal, feeling the cold bite through his glove. This truck was new to him still, but he treated it as though it had already saved his life. Perhaps in time, it would. He bent to the work. First the tires, each inspected for cuts, for signs of sagging. Then the fan belt, stretched tight across pulleys, checked with fingers that had learned to feel weakness before it showed. Oil dipstick drawn, wiped, dipped again. The dark line of oil told its own story, thin but holding. Radiator cap twisted, steam puffing faintly, water level acceptable. Each step done by rote, but none taken lightly. A mistake here could mean a stalled truck on a road where no one could afford delay. Nearby, Davis crouched by his own truck, shoulders hunched under the drizzle. He looked up, grinning faintly through the weariness. "Mud's worse than yesterday," he said, as though the obvious deserved notice. James chuckled softly. "Maybe tomorrow it'll dry." Neither believed it, but the words gave the illusion of hope, and in war even illusions had their use. Sergeant Harris paced the line, boots slapping through puddles, his eyes sharp under the brim of his cap. He said little, but his presence pressed men forward. When he did speak, it was with the certainty of one who had repeated the same speech 100 times. "These trucks are your lifeline," he reminded them. "You know them better than your own families. You'll treat them that way, or you won't last." His voice cut through mist like the whistle at dawn, neither harsh nor kind, but absolute. James climbed into the cab, sliding onto the seat that was as unforgiving as stone. The wheel loomed before him, broad and heavy, demanding strength more than finesse. He turned the key, pressed the starter, and felt the truck shudder as the engine caught. A cough, a growl, then the deep, steady rumble of power ready to be harnessed. It vibrated through the floorboards into his boots, through the wheel into his arms, until it seemed his own heartbeat matched the rhythm. Around him, engines followed suit, one after another, until the motor pool was filled with sound, a low thunder that rolled across the fields, muffled by mist, but unbroken. The air grew thick with exhaust, mingling with rain into a fog that tasted of iron and smoke. Men raised their voices to be heard, though most had little to say. Words mattered less than readiness. The trucks themselves did the speaking. An MP strode past, clipboard in hand, checking numbers painted on bumpers. He called out assignments, designating loads and routes, though no one spoke of destinations beyond the next checkpoint. For security, secrecy wrapped each mission like canvas over cargo. The drivers learned to ask nothing, to know only the weight in their truck and the miles they must cover. James leaned out of the cab to adjust the canvas cover flapping in the breeze. Drops of water struck his cheek, cold enough to sting. He wiped them away with the back of his hand, then settled again, eyes on the road beyond the motor pool. It stretched away into haze, narrow and uncertain, promising miles of mud, hours of vigilance, and perhaps dangers unseen. The convoy began to form. Engines revved, gears clashed as drivers coaxed stubborn transmissions into compliance. Trucks rolled into line, each keeping 60 yards between, as though distance alone could guard against chaos. The ground shook faintly under the weight, mud groaning as it gave way beneath tons of steel and fuel. James felt his truck lurch forward, slow but certain, following the tail lights ahead. The mud clung, but the wheels turned, and in that turning lay the simple truth. The war moved only so long as these trucks did. For a moment, as the convoy crept toward the open road, James looked out across the line. Dozens of trucks, each driven by a man with his own longings, his own silent fears together. They formed a column of resolve, stretching through mist into the unknown. The sight filled him with something he could not name, neither pride nor dread, but a mixture of both, softened by the rhythm of engines, mud and metal. Those were the constants of his world now. Each morning began with the same ritual, boots sinking into earth, hands blackened with grease, trucks answering the call of ignition. It was not glorious, but it was steady, and in that steadiness lay a strange comfort. The convoy left the motor pool, rolling into the gray morning, wheels hissing as they carried their burdens forward. Behind them, the camp settled back into silence, tents sagging under rain, fires burning low. Ahead lay only the road and the endless demand to keep moving. A heavy Jimmy becomes a stubborn friend. The first time James Wilson truly met his truck, the world was still wet from a night of rain, and the morning light had the pale, washed look of a sheet left too long on the line. The truck sat there in the motor pool as if it had been waiting specifically for him. Hood beaded with water, canvas glistening, stance square and stubborn. It wore the white star on its nose the way old boxers wear a broken nose, with a kind of tired pride. The men called it a Jimmy, as if that nickname could soften the fact of its weight, its iron, its will to resist a new driver's hands. The Jimmy was not a romantic machine. It did not purr. It did not pose. It made a constant, low, practical sound that reminded a man there would be labor in any mile that passed beneath its wheels. If a driver wanted cooperation, he would have to earn it the slow way, through patience, through listening, through a learned conversation of boots, palms, and breath. James placed his hand on the fender and felt the chill of the steel come through the damp glove. It felt like a handshake delivered under rain, firm and unadorned. Sergeant Harris had said the day before, with his hands stuffed in his coat, as if to hold in the last of the night's warmth, "Learn the music of the gears, Wilson. The Jimmy's not cruel, just proud. Treat it rough out of hurry, and it'll answer you in kind." A few of the older drivers had smiled at that, not unkindly. They had all learned this lesson, some the easy way, most the hard. James climbed into the open cab and settled onto the seat. It was made for durability, not comfort, a narrow, unyielding bench that invited a man to discover better posture. The steering wheel was bigger than it had any right to be, a dark circle with the weight of a ship's helm, and the pedals sat heavy and far apart, insisting that each choice of foot be deliberate. The smell within the cab was a quiet ledger of the truck's life. Canvas warmed by yesterday's sun, old oil, wet rope, dust lifted by the last breeze and then forgotten. He ran the familiar checks, hand on the shifter to feel its temperament, palm on the dash to steady his breath, heel testing the give of the clutch. Beside him, Davis leaned one shoulder against the door and watched with the indulgent calm of a friend who already knows how a story ends. "Go slow," he said, a smile in his voice. "You can't win a foot race with a mule, and this mule weighs 5 tons. The engine came alive with a cough that was almost polite, then settled into a steady rumble as if clearing its throat and declaring itself ready for business. To start, to truly start, meant more than coaxing fire into cylinders. It meant matching a rhythm that belonged to the truck, not the man, a rhythm that asked for a kind of humility. James pressed the clutch, felt the pedal's long arc, and sent the shifter toward first. The Jimmy refused with a dry grind, metal spelling out a single syllable. No. Even with the clutch down, the gears held their line like dancers offended by an unpracticed partner. Harris's advice returned. Double clutch. Don't ask once, ask twice. Think of it as courtesy. A driver would press the clutch and slip the lever into neutral, release the clutch to let the engine spin, then press again and nudge the lever into gear at the exact moment when speed and teeth matched. Done well, it felt like clicking a watch closed. Done poorly, it scraped like a shovel along stone. James tried again. Clutch in, neutral, clutch out, let the engine come up just enough, clutch in, nudge toward first. The lever eased forward with a soft agreement this time, not exactly friendly, but no longer bristling. The truck moved one clear inch, then another, as though deciding to entertain this arrangement for a while. Across the yard, a mechanic flicked his eyes toward the sound, and hearing no complaint from the gears, returned to his wrench with the small relief of a man who has 100 other things to fix. They practiced in the outskirts, where the ground turned from packed dirt to a proper road that had endured too many wheels and too much rain. The first miles were a lesson in the difference between a simple machine and a stubborn one. The steering did not so much obey as negotiate. Each curve was an agreement reached between the driver's humble request and the truck's sense of prudence. The brakes were a conversation as well. Start early, hold firm, never panic, trust the mass to settle itself like a large animal finding its stance. There is a particular music to gears that are treated with respect. Up from first to second, the engine note drops like a voice calming itself. Second to third requires a breath and a heartbeat. Miss the moment and the reward is a rasp that every man in earshot will recognize as haste. When the timing is right, the lever falls into place as cleanly as a key in a lock. After 10, 20, 30 repetitions, A driver finds himself listening more than he looks, feeling more than he thinks. The road becomes a pulse to measure. The engine becomes a baritone guide. The Jimmy had its quirks, which is to say it had its personality. On a cool morning, it preferred a longer warm-up. Push it too soon and it would shudder, an old dog rising stiffly from the floor. On inclines, the truck wanted to feel the clutch's full, patient sweep. Anything rushed, and it would complain with a protesting chatter. If the load in the bed was fuel, the slosh of the cans announced itself like a reminder to ease up on enthusiasm. Carrying rations, the smell of flour and canned peaches would sometimes drift forward, a strange sweetness that softened even the sergeant's face. They practiced turns around a copse of wind-shaken trees, the canvas in back snapping lightly as the truck leaned and corrected. James found the measure of the wheel. How much to lead a turn, how much to hold, how much to let the truck right its own small correction. In time, the wheel's size felt less like an obstacle and more like a tool scaled to the weight it directed. He learned to keep his arms loose. Fight the wheel and you end the day with shoulders full of nails. Guide it, and the truck acknowledges you with a steady calm. At midday, when the drizzle eased to a mist and light imported itself through the clouds, they pulled over by a hedgerow to eat. Davis produced a sandwich that had more memory of ham than ham itself, and they ate in companionable quiet, heels set on the truck's step. The engine ticked as it cooled. Swallows traced inadvertent letters across the sky. A farmer's dog watched from a distance, alert, but not unkind. Everything felt placed in a wider pattern. The war somewhere beyond the fields. The machine a part of the pattern. The men a quieter part. Still. After lunch they rehearsed the least dramatic and most necessary part of driving, stopping and starting on a grade without letting the truck roll backward. There are tricks to it, and none of them respond to rush. A driver sets the brake with his hand, eases the clutch to find the first grip of torque, releases the brake in a breath that is almost prayer, and allows the machine to claim the road in small advances. Get greedy, and you will bounce, jolt, stall. Get timid, and you will drift back, and someone behind you will have a new story to tell at supper. James found the balance the way a man learns to carry a sleeping child, by feel, by caution, by the wish not to wake anything heavy. Late afternoon brought a brief task with the maintenance crew, checking the lugs on a wheel that had taken a hard bump the day before. The mechanic, Mitchell, had hands like weathered tools and a voice that could scold without anger. "There's tight and there's smart," he said, leaning in to torque the nut a quarter turn. "Tight keeps the wheel on. Smart keeps the stud from snapping tomorrow. You want both." He gave James a look that was almost a nod. "You listen to a truck the way you listen to a person. It tells you what hurts, but not in words." The longer James drove, the more the truck's noises arranged themselves into a language he could parse. Harmless rattles, earnest clatters, the particular high whine that meant a belt would need love before nightfall. Even the tires had their accents. On wet, crushed stone, they hissed like rain through grass. On plank bridges, they thumped a measured, hollow drum. On deep mud, they hummed and asked for patience. The cab transmitted these messages through the seat and the wheel. Little telegrams tapped into bone and muscle, answered not with talk, but with an adjusted foot, or a different line through a bend. Toward evening, they brought the truck back through a small village that had returned to the business of living. A woman lifted a bucket from a well and poured it into a basin with the same steady care James now used on the clutch. A boy pedaled a bicycle whose chain needed oil. He He raised one hand in a shy salute as the truck rolled by, his eyes bright with the private thrill of wheels and speed. In the square, a man mended a shutter. The hammering sounded like punctuation in a long sentence that the day had been writing all along. Back at the motor pool, James parked 4077 in its place, as if tucking a horse into a stall. He cut the engine and sat for a moment in the new quiet, hearing the world widen around him now that the steady note of the motor had ceased. The silence did not feel empty. It felt earned. When he climbed down, he kept a hand on the doorframe a breath longer than necessary, as if to reassure the truck that he would be back in the morning to continue their conversation. Davis slapped the fender lightly. "You two are getting along," he said, not teasing. James nodded. "We came to terms." He didn't mention the first rough shifts, the embarrassing clank that had made a mechanic glance up with the patient expression of a teacher hearing a piano's wrong note from the next room. Those moments had already been folded into the day, into the learning that made tomorrow feel possible. In the dimming light, Sergeant Harris drifted along the line again, hands behind his back. He paused at 4077, eyes moving the way officers' eyes do, over paint, over tires, over small signs that say whether a driver and a machine are making a decent team. "How's she treat you?" he asked. "Like an aunt," James said before he could stop himself. "One who loves you but expects manners?" Harris's mouth made an almost smile. "You'll do," he murmured and moved on. Night settled. The rain returned with a lighter hand, the way a tired drummer might tap a rhythm after a long march. In the tents, low voices found their way to laughter in places. Someone strummed a guitar softly, only 3 chords, all of them reliable. James lay on his cot with his hands folded, and for the first time since he'd met the truck, he understood that he could rest without rehearsing the day's mistakes. Tomorrow, there would be new miles. Tomorrow, there would be the same pedals, the same wheel, the same sounds, and he would meet them with a steadier breath. The Jimmy would not become easier, exactly, but it would become familiar, which is a kind of grace. Familiarity is what makes a driver sense a problem before it announces itself, what teaches him to shift early on a grade to spare the engine, what reminds him to ease the wheel for a pothole that might not harm the tire, but would rattle the cargo enough to loosen latches. Familiarity slows a man's heart when the road narrows and the rain thickens, and tells him, in the quiet voice of experience, "You know how to do this." When the wind lifted the edge of the canvas that night and laid a cool ribbon of air across his face, James thought, not of battles, not of maps, but of the small, stubborn friend waiting in the motor pool. He pictured the curve of the wheel against his palms, the short travel of the shifter, the chorus of the engine when the gear fell home without complaint. If he dreamed, the dream was not of conquest. It was of the narrow lane ahead, hedges leaning close, tires finding purchase, and a truck that answered his careful requests with its own kind of patience. That was enough for one day. In a world that asked for so much, the agreement between a driver and his Jimmy felt both modest and enormous. Tomorrow, he would climb back into the cab and speak that language again. 1 clutch, 2 clutches, a firm hand on the wheel, breath in, breath out, until the road itself seemed to hum along in time. Silent walls divide men more than stone. The camp had its own geography, not written on any map, but understood in the bones of everyone who lived there. The geography was not about hills or rivers, but about lines. Quiet, invisible lines that separated men from one another long before the trucks rolled. They were lines of color, of assignment, of who was trusted to carry a rifle and who was not. James Wilson felt those lines as surely as the damp weight of his wool blanket at night. He did not need to be told. It was there in the way the mess tent filled, one table crowded with black drivers like him, another with white mechanics. The food tasted the same: powdered eggs, toast blackened on the edges, coffee boiled until it could strip paint. But the company was chosen for him, silently, with no one speaking the rule out loud. The Army of 1944 was as segregated as any small town back home. Drivers here, infantry there, white officers at the top of the roster, black enlisted men at the bottom. It was a world ordered not by fairness, but by habit hardened into iron. When James signed his draft card, he hadn't imagined he would be drafted into a second war within the first, one fought not with bullets, but with glances, assignments, and the slow acid of being underestimated. He remembered his friend Davis, leaning back on his cot after lights out, polishing boots with a rag more worn than effective. "They think we're only fit to drive, Wilson," Davis had murmured, eyes half shadowed by the lantern. "Not to fight, not to lead, but we'll show them. Every mile, every ton we deliver will prove them wrong." His voice had not been bitter so much as determined, low and steady, like a vow whispered to the dark. And yet, the walls were there. At roll call, James watched how the sergeant's tone shifted when he barked names from one side of the list to the other. A clipped authority for the white men, a rougher edge for the black. At the motor pool, he noticed who was allowed to handle wrenches freely and who was expected only to drive, hands kept on the wheel instead of under the hood. On Sundays, when chaplains came to hold services, the benches were arranged in a way no one announced, but everyone obeyed. It wasn't always cruel. Sometimes it was simply wearying, like carrying a pack filled with sand. No one mentioned it aloud, but every man carried it, an extra weight, on top of the cargo they already hauled. And in war, every ounce of weight mattered. Still, in the small spaces between orders, men found ways to cross those silent walls. In the mess line, a white mechanic once passed James a slice of apple saved from a shipment, muttering only, "Better you have it. My teeth can't chew it anyway." In the motor pool, Mitchell, the grease-handed staff sergeant, sometimes leaned on a fender beside James and spoke of trucks without noticing who else might hear. For a moment, the walls thinned. Then the whistle would blow, and the wall rebuilt itself, as if the Army's breath could summon bricks out of thin air. James thought of home often, not the big home of Cleveland as a city, but the small home of his neighborhood, where a man's worth was measured by whether he fixed his roof before winter, or shared coal with a neighbor when the snow piled up. Back there, he had worked the pump at his uncle's station alongside anyone who needed gas, white or black, and the exchange was always the same: a nod, a coin, a thank you. Here, the same act, handing over fuel, was divided by uniform, by chart, by the deep, quiet rules of the Army. At night, lying awake with the rain dripping through a seam in the canvas, James let his mind wander to the thought of what would happen if they all were mixed. Drivers, mechanics, officers, just men in a circle with no separation. Would the war stop, or at least soften, if those walls fell? He doubted it, but he believed the road might feel shorter, the weight of the trucks a little lighter. The trucks themselves knew no such division. A Jimmy did not care who sat behind the wheel, so long as the clutch was pressed with patience, the gears respected. A tire went flat under white boots, or black boots the same. Gasoline burned the same shade of flame in every tank. On the road, When mud swallowed an axle or artillery shattered the sky, the walls vanished. Every man depended on the one beside him, not on the color of his face, but on the steadiness of his hands. One evening, Davis spoke again as the lamplight flickered low. "We're making history, Wilson, and half the folks back home won't even know it. They'll write about the tanks, about the generals, about the boys who stormed the beaches, but not about us. We'll have to carry our own story." James nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle in. Perhaps that was the hardest wall of all, the wall of silence that history might lay around them. And yet, he also felt a kind of quiet defiance rise. They were here. They were driving. They were keeping armies alive mile after mile. No wall could erase that. The rain eased outside, leaving the canvas walls of the tent slick and shining in the moonlight. James closed his eyes, listening to the trucks shift in their sleep, steel cooling, engines ticking down. For all the silent divisions, there was also this truth. The road tomorrow would need every hand, every driver, every man. And when the convoy rolled, walls or not, they would roll together. A friend's quiet story softened the miles. The road, James would learn, was long not only in distance but in silence. Hours stretched between villages, between checkpoints, between the brief breaks where coffee scalded in tin cups and boots found a patch of dry ground. In those hours, silence had a way of pressing down, heavier than any crate of ammunition or drum of fuel. Silence could turn a mile into a season. It was Davis who first discovered the cure. Not a loud cure, not the kind to stir laughter across the convoy, but a soft one, a thread of story unwound from the spools of his memory. He had a way of beginning without warning, as though the story had been waiting in the air and simply chose him as a mouthpiece. They were driving through a morning mist when it first happened. The convoy was steady, trucks spaced like beads on a string, engines humming in their practiced rhythm. James was at the wheel, his eyes on the faint glow of the cat-eye reflectors of the truck ahead. Davis leaned back, boots propped against the dashboard, his cap tilted low over his brow. "You ever hear about the pine woods in Oregon?" he asked, his voice lazy, as if he were still half asleep. James shook his head, careful not to take his eyes from the road. "Tallest trees you ever saw," Davis said, "straight up like church steeples. When the wind blows, they don't bend much, they hum, deep, low. You can feel it in your ribs, like standing too close to a big drum." James almost smiled. He could picture it, though he'd never seen it. Long green spires whispering against the sky, a boy standing in their shadows. "You worked there?" he asked. Davis nodded, a small motion. "2 summers. My old man cut the logs. I drove the truck. Learned early that wheels can save a man's back more than muscle ever will. Funny how that turned into this." He gestured to the endless line of trucks, the road unwinding ahead. The story rolled on, not in a hurry. Davis spoke of creeks that flashed with salmon, of mornings when the fog clung so thick you could hear axes but not see the men swinging them. He described the smell of sap, sharp and sweet, and the way sawdust floated in the air like golden snow. Each word filled the silence, turned the monotony into something bearable, almost comforting. James realized that in listening, his grip on the wheel eased. The road seemed less sharp-edged, the miles less cruel. It wasn't that the mud had thinned or the potholes smoothed. It was that his mind had somewhere gentler to rest. The next day, when James took his turn off the wheel, he tried his own hand at the quiet art. The convoy rumbled eastward, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. He cleared his throat. You ever smell bread cooling on a Cleveland street? Davis tilted an eye open. Can't say I have. There's a bakery by the gas station where I worked, James said. Mrs. Petrovich runs it. Every morning, before I opened up the pumps, she set loaves on the window ledge to cool. Rye bread, round as the moon, crust so dark it looked burnt but wasn't. You could smell it a block away. I'd pump gas with my stomach growling till she took pity and slipped me the end piece. Davis chuckled, a low sound swallowed by the engine's hum. Sounds better than army toast. Everything's better than army toast, James said, and for a moment both men laughed, quiet, but real. The sound filled the cab more than words had in days, so it became a kind of ritual. Miles measured not only by signposts and fuel stops, but by the rhythm of memory traded back and forth. Davis told of his mother's cornbread, baked in a cast-iron skillet so old the handle was polished smooth by hands. James told of sneaking into the back row of a movie house to watch Western reels, the horse hooves beating in time with his own young heart. Davis told of a cousin who swore he could whistle birds down from the trees, and James countered with a neighbor who claimed he'd once shaken Babe Ruth's hand. Some stories were true, some half-true, some stretched like canvas in the rain. Truth mattered less than the telling. What mattered was the slow weaving of companionship, the net that kept loneliness from swallowing them whole. And sometimes the stories fell into silence, but it was a different silence now. Not the crushing kind, but the easy sort, like two old men on a porch swing, each rocking to the same invisible rhythm, neither needing to fill the air. There were darker tales, too, the kind that surfaced when fatigue blurred the edges of caution. Late one night, under blackout conditions, Davis spoke of a brother who'd gone to the Pacific and never written back. He didn't say he feared him dead, but the words hung in the air like smoke. James listened, said nothing, only kept the truck steady as if the smoothness of the ride could ease the weight. Another night, James admitted he sometimes dreamed of returning home only to find his street empty, the house shuttered, everyone gone. Davis's hand rested briefly on the dash, a wordless acknowledgement. These small confessions, traded in whispers between the grind of gears, felt dangerous in their own way, like driving without lights. But they built a trust stronger than any order could command. The road accepted these offerings. The hedgerows bent close to listen. The rain carried the words forward. The wheels themselves seemed to hum in time, and when the convoy halted for fuel or rations, the two men carried those stories with them, like secret cargo that made every mile less lonely. It struck James, one quiet dawn as the mist lifted and the first birds began to stir, that perhaps this was the true fuel of the Red Ball Express. Not just gasoline and rations, but stories, threads of memory passed from one soldier to another, binding them together more tightly than steel. He kept his eyes on the cat eyes ahead, steady and patient, and thought of how strange it was. In the midst of a war that shouted with guns and thunder, what kept them moving was often the softest sound of all, a friend's quiet story carried across the miles. Waves carried trucks into a scarred France. When the order came to load onto the LSTS, those lumbering landing ship tanks built to swallow trucks whole, James felt the air tighten around him as if the entire camp were holding its breath. The invasion had been whispered about for weeks, and though the drivers weren't storming the beaches in the first wave, they knew their turn was close. Trucks, after all, would follow wherever men and tanks went. Armies could not march on courage alone. They needed beans, bullets, and fuel. The morning they rolled down the ramps into the waiting mouths of the ships, the harbor was gray with mist. Rain had fallen through the night, leaving puddles that reflected the shapes of cranes and half-loaded ships. The Jimmy groaned as James guided it onto the metal deck, tires slipping slightly on the damp steel. The cavernous hold echoed with the cough of engines and the bark of officers directing traffic. Once the trucks were chained down, men clambered up ladders to the cramped bunks above, where canvas hammocks swayed with every swell of the sea. For 3 days, they lived inside that floating steel box. The sea heaved, and the men heaved with it. Some retched into buckets. Others lay pale and sweating on their bunks, praying for land. James had never been on water bigger than Lake Erie, and now, here he was, carried across the channel with an army of trucks. The smell of diesel mixed with salt air, with the acrid tang of vomit, with the faint sweetness of chocolate from rations tucked in pockets. On the third morning, a shout rang down the ladder. "France ahead!" Men crowded the deck, blinking into the pale horizon. At first, James saw nothing but gray sea, darker gray sky. Then, faintly, the line of land appeared, low, broken, scarred. Smoke still rose in patches where battles had raged only days before. The sound carried across the water, too. Artillery rumbling inland, the drone of planes, the occasional crack of a naval gun still shelling distant targets. When the ship ground forward and the ramp dropped, James's hands were slick on the wheel. The sergeant shouted, "Go!" And one by one the trucks rolled down into the surf. The cold water surged halfway up the doors, slapping against the cab, finding every seam in his boots. James pressed the accelerator, heart pounding as the Jimmy sputtered, coughed, then steadied itself, pushing through the salt waves onto the sand. What lay before them was not a quiet countryside, but a scene of stunned chaos. The beach at Normandy was a hive. Men, vehicles, bulldozers pushing earth, engineers laying down mats of steel so trucks wouldn't sink. Wrecked landing craft lay twisted on the shore, their steel shells torn by fire. Here and there, shapes lay covered by tarps, reminders that the price of this ground had been paid in blood. James gripped the wheel tighter, swallowing against the lump in his throat. "Keep moving!" an MP shouted, waving his arm with urgency. "Don't stop on the beach." So they drove, tires sliding in sand, engines straining up the makeshift ramps. At the top of the bluff, the air smelled of cordite and churned earth. The road inland was nothing more than a scar cut by engineers, bordered by piles of equipment, crates of ammunition, and lines of soldiers heading the other way, toward the front. James's eyes caught those soldiers as they passed. Their faces were streaked with dirt and exhaustion, some with blood. A few managed to nod at the drivers, as if grateful the supplies were coming. Others stared past them, eyes still locked on whatever they had seen on the beaches days before. James knew then that his war would be different. His battle was not to storm, but to keep rolling, mile after mile, no matter what lay ahead. The convoy wound its way inland, through fields still scarred by shell holes, past hedgerows that had been shredded by gunfire. Birds startled from the branches as the trucks rumbled past, their cries thin against the noise of engines. Farmers' houses stood broken, roofs gone, walls crumbled, yet smoke still curled from a few chimneys, signs that life insisted on going on, even here. By late afternoon, they reached their first stop, a makeshift depot 10 miles inland. Soldiers swarmed the arriving trucks, unloading crates, stacking fuel cans in pyramids, rolling tires into neat rows. James killed the engine and sat for a moment in the sudden quiet. He could still hear the sea behind him, still taste the salt on his lips. He felt older, Though no time had truly passed, France had changed him in a single day. That night, camped under a patch of canvas with rain dripping steadily, James lay awake, listening. The ground was soft, turned to mud by boots and wheels, but the sound carried. Distant artillery like a heartbeat, the mutter of men dreaming, the drip of water. He thought of the bakery in Cleveland, the smell of rye bread drifting into morning. He thought of Davis's pine forests, tall and humming. He thought of how the war had opened into this scarred land, and how his small task was now woven into its vastness. Davis's voice came quietly from the next cot. "We're in it now, Wilson." James nodded in the dark, though no one could see. "Yeah," he said softly. "We are." The trucks, lined up nearby, seemed to breathe with them, engines cooling, steel ticking in the night. They too had crossed the sea. They too had rolled through fire into a new world. Tomorrow, they would carry their first loads deeper into France. Tomorrow, the long road of the Red Ball would truly begin. Hedgerows crowd the narrow, winding lanes. Morning in Normandy carried a deceptive calm. The air was damp with dew, mist rising from fields that had been green long before war reached them. Birds fluttered among branches as if nothing had changed, as if artillery had not scarred the earth just miles away. Yet for James Wilson and the convoy, the day's challenge was not artillery, nor even the fear of ambush. It was the hedgerows, the thick, ancient walls of earth and vegetation that seemed to have grown out of time itself. James had heard the word before. Hedgerow. It sounded almost gentle, something you might imagine in a storybook, a low fence where rabbits burrowed and children chased butterflies. But here in Normandy, the hedgerows were fortresses. Each one was centuries old, built up of earth, rooted deep with trees and shrubs. Some were taller than a man on horseback, so dense that even light struggled to pass through. And the roads cut between them were narrow, so narrow that when two trucks met, both drivers had to hold their breath. From his seat behind the jimmy's wheel, James felt the closeness of those walls pressing on him. The leaves brushed against the canvas sides, whispering as though they were keeping secrets. The road dipped into shadows, then burst suddenly into patches of sunlight. It twisted, turned, doubled back on itself. At every bend, James imagined German eyes watching, rifles waiting. The convoy rules had been drilled into him. Keep 60 yards apart, no passing, no stopping unless ordered. But here, 60 yards felt like 6. The road bent so sharply that sometimes the only sign of the truck ahead was the faint glow of its tail light through the green gloom. James's hands ached from gripping the wheel, his eyes strained against the shadows. Davis sat beside him, silent at first, then murmured, "Feels like driving through tunnels." Earth on both sides, sky cut off. Like the world's closing in, James nodded. If we had to fight through this, he let the thought trail off. They both knew what that would mean. Every hedgerow was a ready-made trench, every crossroad a choke point. For the infantry, it was misery. For the truckers, it was a constant gamble. Would the road ahead still be clear? Or would it end in a crater, a wreck, a sudden burst of fire? And yet, the countryside had its strange beauty. In rare moments when the road widened, James caught glimpses of rolling fields, dotted with cows, or the distant spire of a stone church. Farmers worked where they could, guiding oxen through furrows, their faces lined but steady. Children peered from doorways, some daring to wave as the convoy passed, their small hands flashing like bright signals against the gloom. The trucks carried everything: gasoline sloshing in cans, crates of artillery shells, rations packed in wooden boxes. Each load was a heartbeat of the army ahead, and each mile was a risk. James remembered what Sergeant Harris had said back in England. Without us, no bullets, no bread, no bandages. The truth of it pressed on him more heavily than the cargo itself. By midday, the road turned worse. Rain, light at first, began to fall, turning dust into slick mud. Tires slipped. Mud sprayed up, coating windshields and goggles. When James tried to wipe the glass, it smeared more than cleared, leaving streaks that blurred his vision. He leaned forward, squinting through the narrow, clean patch. The truck jolted hard as it hit a rut, and for a moment, he thought the whole load might shift. "Easy," Davis muttered. His hand braced against the dash, knuckles white. James grunted. Truck's got a mind of its own. Ahead, the convoy slowed near a crossroads. An MP stood in the rain, directing traffic with one arm, while his other clutched a poncho tight against his body. His helmet glistened wet, his whistle sharp even through the downpour. He waved them through quickly. Red Ball Express had priority, but his eyes looked weary, as if he had been standing in that rain since dawn. The hedgerows didn't stop for weather. If anything, they grew darker, more oppressive, water dripping from every leaf, pooling at the edges of the road. Visibility shrank further, and the drivers leaned forward over their wheels, eyes searching for the faint glow of cat eyes ahead. James could feel the tension across the convoy, stretched taut like a rope. Then came the sound, a faint crump, distant but unmistakable. Artillery. The Germans might have been retreating, but they weren't gone. Another shell, closer this time, sent a shudder through the ground. The convoy halted on instinct, men climbing out, pressing themselves into the ditches alongside the road. James and Davis dropped low, mud soaking through their uniforms. They waited, hearts thudding in time with the rain. Minutes passed. The shells did not fall closer. Somewhere ahead, perhaps another crossroad was under fire. Slowly, the signal came down the line. Move. Engines coughed back to life, wheels spun in the mud, and the convoy crept forward again. The road stretched on, mile after mile, each bend a new uncertainty. As dusk approached, the hedgerows thinned at last, giving way to open fields. The relief was almost physical. The sky widened. The air seemed lighter. The convoy gathered speed, engines humming stronger. James exhaled, realizing only then how tightly he had been holding his breath all day. That night, camped near a ruined village, he and Davis sat by a small fire shielded under half a canvas. Rain hissed softly on the embers. Davis poked at the coals with a stick, eyes reflecting the glow. "Those hedgerows," he said, "like driving through a maze someone built just to trap you." James nodded slowly. "But we made it through." Davis's mouth curved in the faintest smile. One day at a time. The fire burned low, and the night wrapped around them. The trucks loomed in the dark, their shapes steady, their presence a kind of comfort. Tomorrow, the road would rise again, with hedgerows or mud or worse. But tonight, the convoy had survived another day. The war quickens, dust rising with the march. The hedgerows of Normandy, stubborn and ancient, had held the Allies back for weeks. But then, almost overnight, the stalemate broke. It was late July when the air itself seemed to shudder, waves of bombers sweeping over the front, pounding the German defenses into rubble. The ground shook, smoke curled up like a forest of gray trees, and rumors spread down the line. Patton was moving. James heard it first from a supply sergeant, a man too tired to embellish. "Broke through at St. Lo," the sergeant muttered while tallying crates. "Road's open. They're pushing fast. Faster than we can count." The words felt like sparks landing on dry straw. Within hours, the atmosphere in camp had changed. Drivers spoke in hushed voices, their eyes wide. Faster than we can count. The change reached James and Davis soon enough. Their orders doubled in urgency. Where before a convoy might deliver within a day's drive, now the destinations lay 2-3 days inland. Patton's tanks were racing east, sometimes 40 miles in a day, devouring gasoline like thirsty beasts. And it was the trucks, the endless lines of jimmies that fed them. The roads were no kinder for all that urgency. Dust rose thick in the summer heat, turning every convoy into a moving cloud. Engines strained, men coughed into their sleeves, goggles turned opaque within minutes. When James wiped his face, the rag came away brown. "We're eating half of France," Davis joked once, spitting dust onto the roadside. Yet the pace pressed them forward. Where hedgerows once hemmed them in, now open farmland stretched wide. They passed villages half ruined, half living. Old men sweeping rubble from doorsteps, women carrying buckets from wells, children running barefoot to wave at the trucks. In one town, James slowed as an old man raised a bottle of wine in salute, tears glistening on his face. Davis leaned out the window, calling softly, "Merci." The man clutched his chest, nodding as though that single word had bridged oceans. The convoys grew larger too. Dozens of trucks stretching out of sight, each with its red circle painted bold, each carrying the lifeblood of the advance. Military police guarded intersections, clearing the way, their whistles sharp, their arms waving with authority. For the first time, James felt what it meant. They weren't just drivers anymore. They were the arteries of an entire army. But with speed came danger. The Germans were falling back, yes, but not without teeth. Artillery still rumbled. Snipers lingered in villages. Bridges lay shattered, forcing endless detours. Once, James's convoy halted for hours as engineers built a makeshift span across a river, logs groaning under the weight of each truck that passed. Another time, they diverted through fields, tires sinking into the soft earth, the convoy dragging itself forward like a beast in the mire. The dust was relentless. By late afternoon, James's tongue felt coated in clay. The truck rattled, every bolt buzzing in sympathy with the road. Davis, half dozing in the passenger seat, stirred awake to mutter, "Whole country's turning to powder. If we stop too long, we'll be statues." James only grunted, eyes narrowed against the glare. At night, the dust gave way to darkness. Blackout driving resumed, the cat eyes ahead glowing faint, red slits in the void. James's world shrank to those two dim lights and the steady hum of the engine. His hands moved without thought. Clutch, gear, brake, accelerator. Sometimes he wondered if he was awake at all, or if the road itself had entered his dreams. One evening, near Le Mans, they heard the thunder before they saw it. Tanks, dozens of them, lined up to refuel. Their crews stood nearby, faces hollow with fatigue, but grins wide as the gasoline poured in. One sergeant slapped James's fender, shouting, "You boys are saving our hides." The words carried a heat stronger than any meal. For once, James believed them. The days blurred. Drive, unload, reload, drive again. Dust by day, darkness by night. Food tasted of grit, sleep came in stolen snatches. Yet the advance never slowed. The map on the wall of the supply tent showed it best. Lines inching eastward, faster each day, then leaping, bounding toward Paris. James traced it with his finger once, the black grease on his hand smudging the paper. Paris. The word felt impossible, like a dream whispered on a sleepless night. Davis, ever the anchor, said it plainly. "We're not fighting with rifles, Wilson." But without us, they'd stall. Every gallon, every shell, were the legs under Patton's boots. James only nodded, too tired to argue, too aware of the truth. One night, as they crept along under blackout, rain began to fall. Fine at first, then heavy. The dust turned instantly to mud, thick and sucking. Tires spun, engines groaned. A truck ahead veered too far to the right and slid into a ditch. The convoy halted, men piling out, ropes and winches snapping taut as they dragged it free. The rain soaked them through, plastering uniforms to skin. Yet when the truck lurched back onto the road, a ragged cheer rose. Even in the rain, even in exhaustion, the convoy kept rolling, and so the war quickened, and they quickened with it. Dust or mud, day or night, the trucks pressed on, bearing supplies as vital as blood. James felt himself shrinking into the rhythm, no longer a boy from Cleveland, no longer even a soldier in the abstract sense. He was simply a driver on a road that never ended, carrying the weight of an army's hunger and hope. When he lay down at night, under canvas or stars, the sound of the engine still hummed in his ears. In dreams, the dust still choked him, the cat eyes still glowed ahead. And always, when he woke, the road was waiting. Red circles mark a lifeline on wheels. The order came down on a warm August morning, the air thick with dust and tension. A colonel none of them had seen before stood high on the hood of a jeep, his voice carrying above the rumble of idling engines. He spoke of speed, of armies outpacing their supplies, of Patton's tanks burning through fuel faster than any chart had predicted. Then he named it, the Red Ball Express. The name rolled through the gathered men like a ripple. Red Ball, someone whispered. Sounds like a circus train, another muttered, though his voice held no laughter. But the colonel's tone left no doubt. This was no show. This was necessity. Within hours, paintbrushes appeared, dipped into bright red. Large circles were slapped onto truck bumpers, onto doors, sometimes onto the canvas sides. They gleamed in the sunlight, raw and unmistakable. James watched as a private traced one carefully across the Jimmy's front bumper. The paint dripped, uneven but bold. A mark of priority, a mark of pressure. That evening, James and Davis stood together, looking at their truck. The circle caught the last light of the day, glowing almost crimson. Davis tilted his head. "Looks like a target," he said softly. James swallowed. He couldn't deny it. The Red Ball rules were strict. Convoys would run day and night. Minimal stops, 60-yard intervals, top speed 25 unless conditions allowed more. No passing, no delays, no excuses. MPs were stationed at intersections, roads cleared exclusively for the painted trucks. The route stretched like a lifeline, from the beaches and depots all the way to the fast-moving front. "Keep them rolling," the mimeographed sheet had said, bold letters across the bottom. James tucked his copy into his breast pocket, as if carrying the words would help. The first convoy formed the next dawn. Dozens of trucks lined nose to tail, each bearing its red mark. The engines roared in unison, the air thick with exhaust and anticipation. At precisely 600, an MP dropped his arm. The line lurched forward. The Red Ball Express was born. James gripped the wheel, his palms slick. Ahead stretched the dust-choked road, already scarred by countless boots and tires. The trucks moved like a river, endless, determined. Davis sat beside him, rifle propped between his knees, his eyes scanning the horizon. "This is it," he murmured. "We're the blood in the veins now." The hours blurred. The convoy 8 miles, swallowing crossroads, bridging rivers. Fuel stops became orchestrated ballets, service troops swarming each truck, refilling tanks, checking tires, wiping windshields. 20 minutes. No more. Then, back on the road. Even meals were rushed. Cold coffee, hard biscuits, swallowed in haste. The red circles grew familiar. Everywhere James looked, another truck bore the same mark. On narrow roads, they stretched in both directions. At night, even in blackout, he could sense them. An army of engines, all bound by the same demand. It wasn't glamorous. It was mud spattering up to the canvas tops, dust clinging to sweat-soaked collars, engines grinding up hills that seemed endless. It was men nodding off in their seats, jolted awake by potholes. It was trucks breaking down, hauled aside while mechanics worked frantically, cannibalizing parts just to keep the wheels turning. But there were moments when the weight of it struck James. Once, they passed a stalled line of tanks, their crews pacing, anxious. As the red ball trucks rolled in, loaded with gasoline, the tankers cheered, loud, raw, genuine. Another time, infantrymen, hollow-eyed from days in the field, raised their helmets in salute as crates of rations were unloaded. Each time, James felt the circle on his bumper burn brighter. Yes, it was a target, but it was also a promise. The danger was real. Rumors spread quickly. Convoys ambushed, bridges shelled, drivers killed. The Germans knew the lifeline was there, and they struck when they could. Every shadow on the road seemed deeper now, every bend a potential trap. Davis kept his rifle close, though both men knew a carbine was little against a machine gun. One night, in the dim glow of blackout cat eyes, James asked quietly, "You think we can keep it up?" Davis didn't answer right away. He stared out into the darkness, the faint glow of a cigarette tip marking his breath. Finally, he said, "We have to. No choice. If we stop, they stop. And if they stop..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The Red Ball Express was more than an order. It became a rhythm, a heartbeat. The trucks rolled, always rolled, through rain and mud, through dust and heat, through fear and exhaustion. Every mile carried risk. Every mile carried hope. James learned to measure time not in hours, but in convoys. One convoy out, another back. Supplies forward, empties and wounded back. The cycle never broke, not even when sleep blurred into waking, not even when men staggered like ghosts beside their trucks. And through it all, the red circles glared from their bumpers, marks of duty, marks of burden. Soldiers, along the way, began to call them by name. "Here come the Red Ball boys." And sometimes, just sometimes, the words carried pride instead of irony. James would remember those days as a blur of motion, of roads that never ended, of a circle painted in red that meant everything. It was the lifeline of an army, the thread of victory pulled mile by men who asked for no glory, only the chance to keep rolling. Cat-eye lights guide the long silent night. Night on the Red Ball Road was a world of its own. By day, the convoys moved through dust and villages, past cheering children and weary soldiers, but at night, everything changed. The sun slipped beneath the horizon, and with it went all the familiar points of reference. The road became a ribbon of darkness, the fields melted into shadow, and the only thing a driver had to cling to were the tiny, slitted cat-eye lights of the truck ahead. James had trained for blackout driving back in England, inching through fields with canvas covering the headlights, but training could never match the reality. Out here, there was no instructor's whistle, no safe perimeter. Here, there was only the quiet hum of dozens of trucks, the faint glow of red dots floating like ghosts, and the knowledge that beyond that light could be a ditch, a crater, or worse. He settled into the seat, leaning forward, every muscle taut. The world shrank to two small red blurs. If they doubled, he was at the right distance. If they grew too sharp, he was too close. If they vanished, God help him, he was alone in the dark. The silence was not true silence, of course. Engines rumbled, tires hissed on wet ground, gears ground when drivers missed their double clutch. Yet somehow, in the vast darkness, even those sounds seemed muffled, absorbed by the night. The convoy became a beast moving cautiously, its many lungs exhaling diesel smoke, its many legs trudging forward in rhythm. Davis, beside him, dozed and woke in fits, his carbine across his lap. Every few minutes, he'd lift his head, rub his eyes, and peer out the windshield as though making sure they were still on the road. "Keep your eyes on the cats," he murmured, voice heavy with fatigue. James didn't answer. His eyes hadn't strayed once. The hours stretched strangely. Sometimes the trucks crept along at 15 miles per hour, feeling slower than a man's walk. Sometimes, on better roads, they pushed to 25, which in blackout felt like racing blindfolded. James felt his heart in his throat whenever the road curved, the glow ahead disappearing for a breath, returning only after his own wheels had followed. Rain began near midnight. First a fine mist, then a steady fall, drumming on the canvas roof. The cat eyes blurred, their faint glow smeared by water on the windshield. James flicked the wipers, but they squealed, barely keeping pace. His hands cramped on the wheel. The Jimmy swayed, tires slipping in fresh mud. Every jolt sent adrenaline through him, as if the truck itself were trying to escape his grip. Then came the halt. The glow ahead winked out. James pressed the brake, heart racing. Around them, engines idled, their low growl uneasy. Davis jerked awake. "What is it?" "I lost the eyes," James whispered, though there was no need. The convoy had stopped. He cracked open the door. Rain spattered his face, cold and sharp. Down the line, figures moved with flashlights hooded in red, their beams pointing at the ground. Voices floated back, muffled. A bridge was gone, blown out by retreating Germans or swallowed by the swollen river. Engineers were already unloading timbers, their hammers ringing faint in the storm. Hours passed. Men dozed in cabs, curled on hard seats, or smoked in silence under ponchos. James sat with his head against the wheel, listening to the rain. He thought of Cleveland nights, of neon signs glowing outside the gas station, of the hum of insects in summer air. Now his world was rain, mud, and two dim lights ahead that no longer moved. At last, near dawn, the word came: repaired. Engines roared back to life, one after another. The glow reappeared, trembling through the mist. The convoy moved, slow and cautious, over the makeshift bridge. James felt the planks flex beneath him, heard the river rushing through gaps. But they crossed, one by one, and the road resumed. That morning, as the sun rose gray behind clouds, James realized he had driven nearly 12 hours without rest. His body ached, his mind felt wrapped in fog, and yet the road ahead demanded more. He glanced at Davis, who was already asleep again, head against the window. For a moment, James envied him. Then he turned back to the cat eyes, steady in their faint glow, and drove on. The cat-eye nights became their rhythm, nights when the world disappeared except for two tiny lights, nights when the rain blurred vision and the mud clutched at wheels, nights when trucks broke down and men worked by feel alone, tools clattering in the dark, nights when gunfire rattled from some unseen hedgerow and every driver pressed low over the wheel, waiting for it to pass. They were nights that aged boys into men, nights that carved the Red Ball Express into memory, Rain pounds as bridges wash into rivers. The weather in Normandy had a way of conspiring against the drivers. When the skies opened, it wasn't a gentle drizzle. It was a relentless, soaking rain that turned everything into a test. The dirt roads dissolved into sucking mud. Canvas tents sagged under the weight of water, and the bridges, fragile spans across swollen rivers, gave way, one by one, as if the land itself sought to halt the convoys. James first saw it at dusk, a long line of trucks slowed to a crawl. The river ahead had swallowed its crossing, leaving nothing but jagged pilings jutting out of the torrent. Engineers swarmed like ants, shouting over the roar of water. Some carried timbers, others unspooled steel cables. Their faces were dark with mud, their coats plastered to their skin. The convoy halted, engines ticking, headlights dimmed to slits. Davis leaned forward, peering through the rain-streaked windshield. "We'll be here a while." James didn't answer. His hands rested on the wheel, muscles tight. He could feel the impatience humming through the line of trucks. Each vehicle was heavy with cargo, fuel, rations, shells, that had to reach Patton's spearhead. Yet the river didn't care. It surged and foamed, mocking their urgency. The hours dragged. Some drivers dozed in their seats. Others climbed down to smoke, their cigarettes shielded under helmets. James sat still, watching the engineers. Their lanterns threw shaky circles of light on the dark water. He saw timbers hauled into place, ropes tightening as men shouted in rhythm, the sound of hammers ringing against steel. It was backbreaking work in the worst conditions, and yet the engineers moved with the steadiness of men who knew there was no alternative. By midnight, the rain had intensified. Water streamed down the windshield in sheets. James wiped it with his sleeve, though it did no good. The waiting pressed on him like a weight. The cab smelled of damp canvas, wet wool, and fatigue. Davis snored softly beside him, his carbine across his chest. Outside, the river thundered, rising by the hour. "Bridge won't hold if the water keeps climbing," James muttered to himself. The thought settled into his stomach like a stone. Near dawn, word filtered back. One truck at a time. The temporary bridge had been rigged, rough and shaky but passable. Engines coughed awake, gears ground, and the first truck inched forward. Every driver leaned out, straining to see. The timbers groaned, the whole structure swaying under the weight. But the truck reached the far side, mud spraying from its tires. James's turn came an hour later. He eased forward, the jimmy's load shifting slightly. The bridge creaked, water lapped at its edges. He could see gaps between the planks, flashes of white foam below. His knuckles turned pale on the wheel. Davis, fully awake now, whispered, "Steady, steady." Halfway across, there was a sharp crack. The truck lurched, tilting as one timber snapped. For a heartbeat, James thought the entire span would collapse. He pressed the accelerator, the engine roared, and the truck leapt forward, slamming onto firmer ground. Both men exhaled, their breath visible in the cool dawn air. Behind them, another driver wasn't so lucky. A rear wheel slipped through a weakened section, trapping the truck at a dangerous angle. Shouts rose, ropes were thrown, men strained on winches. For 30 minutes, the convoy waited as mud and rain fought against human muscle. At last, with a screech of metal and wood, the truck was hauled free. The line inched forward again. By the time all vehicles had crossed, the sun was high, pale and watery through the clouds. The men were exhausted before the day had even begun. Yet the road stretched on, another 40 miles to the next supply dump. The rain showed no sign of stopping. For the drivers, bridges became their nightmares. Each river crossing carried a fresh uncertainty. Some bridges were blown by retreating Germans, others collapsed under weather, still others were simply gone. Each time, engineers appeared as if conjured, dragging lumber and beams, swearing and sweating, rebuilding under the gaze of nervous drivers. One night, James found himself waiting again, the convoy halted by yet another ruined span. He and Davis sat under their canvas, sipping weak coffee, their boots caked with mud. Davis spoke quietly. "Feels like the rivers are fighting harder than the Germans." James almost smiled. At least the rivers don't shoot back. Yet in truth, the rivers felt like enemies all their own. They stole hours, sometimes days, from the red ball schedule. They frayed tempers, drained strength, and they taught patience, the kind born not of choice, but of necessity. By September, when the rains grew colder, every driver had stories of bridges. Some recalled timbers cracking under their wheels. Others remembered watching entire sections collapse behind the last truck to cross. A few trucks were lost entirely, their cargo swallowed by the current. Each loss was felt like a personal wound. Still, the convoys rolled on. The Red Ball Express didn't pause for weather. It didn't pause for swollen rivers or broken bridges. Somehow, with grit and desperation, the engineers rebuilt, the drivers waited, and the lifeline flowed forward again. Villagers share wine, flowers, and smiles. The Red Ball Express was built for speed, for urgency, for relentless movement across France. But every so often, between the long nights and the endless dust, there came moments that slowed time itself, moments born not of orders or schedules, but of the people who lived along the road. It was in small villages, often little more than a cluster of stone houses and a church spire, that James first felt it. The convoy would rumble through, engines rattling, tires sending up dust, and the people would appear. Suddenly, as if drawn by the sound of the trucks, old men in caps, women with scarves knotted under their chins, children barefoot and laughing, all lined the roadside. They waved, they clapped, they shouted words James could not always understand. Sometimes they cried, sometimes they stood in silence, simply watching the long line of olive-drab trucks pass like a river. James remembered one evening especially. The convoy had slowed to navigate a narrow main street, the buildings so close the truck mirrors nearly scraped the stone walls. From an open window above, a young woman leaned out, her arms filled with flowers, wild poppies, daisies, whatever had survived the fighting. She tossed them down, and a handful landed on James's hood. He glanced at Davis, who grinned, shaking his head. "Guess she likes your..." Driving in another town, the convoy was stopped by a temporary traffic jam. While the trucks idled, villagers approached. An old man shuffled forward with a bottle of red wine, offering it with both hands to whichever driver would take it. James hesitated, then accepted, bowing his head in thanks. The man's eyes filled with tears. He gripped James's wrist tightly, saying words James couldn't follow but whose meaning was clear enough. Gratitude, relief, a sense of deliverance. There were children too, always children. They chased the trucks, their arms outstretched, calling, "Chocolate! Gum!" Some drivers tossed sticks of chewing gum or bits of candy saved from rations. The children caught them with squeals of delight. For James, those small gifts felt heavier than the cargo he carried. Tiny tokens bridging the vast gap between soldiers and civilians. The roads bore scars, of course. In one village, James noticed whole blocks reduced to rubble. Only the church stood, its bell tower cracked but still upright. Women in worn dresses swept debris from their doorsteps, determined to reclaim some order. Yet when the trucks came, they smiled, lifting their hands in weary greeting. James thought of his mother back in Cleveland, how she might wave if strangers rolled through her street, bringing supplies and, perhaps, hope. Sometimes the encounters were quiet. In a hamlet surrounded by fields, an old woman stood alone at the roadside. She raised her hand as the convoy passed, but her face was solemn. James met her eyes for only a moment, yet the look stayed with him. It carried the weight of 4 years under occupation, of hunger and fear. Her wave was not celebration, it was acknowledgement, a weary blessing given to men she would never see again. The drivers spoke of these encounters often, usually in low voices at rest stops. "They treat us like heroes," one said, shaking his head. "All we're doing is hauling gas and beans." Another replied, "That's enough. To them, it means the war's moving away." For James and Davis, it became a rhythm. Long miles of mud and dust punctuated by brief flashes of humanity. A flower tossed, a bottle shared, a child's laugh. Each one a reminder that beyond the logistics, beyond the tonnage and timetables, the Red Ball Express carried something invisible. Hope, perhaps, or simply proof that the tide had turned. One afternoon, as they rolled into a larger town, the scale startled them. Hundreds lined the streets, cheering, waving flags hastily stitched together. A band played from the steps of the town hall, its notes wobbly but determined. James could barely hear the engine over the noise. Davis leaned out, shouting, "We're no parade." But his grin betrayed him. For a few moments it felt like one. Yet even in celebration, the war's shadow lingered. In that same town, James saw a burned-out German half-track at the square's edge. Children climbed on it as though it were playground equipment. The adults ignored it, focusing instead on the trucks. The contrast struck him. Ruins beside renewal, destruction beside gratitude. Later that night, camped in a muddy field, James pulled the crumpled flower from the truck's hood. It was wilted, its petals drooping, yet he set it carefully on the dash. Davis noticed. "Souvenir?" he teased. "Reminder," James said softly, "of what we're driving through." Who we're driving for? The flower stayed there for weeks, drying into a fragile husk. Each time James saw it, he thought of the villagers' faces, of hands raised in thanks, of voices calling out into the dust. The war was far from over. There were still rivers to cross, roads to repair, convoys to keep rolling. But in those fleeting roadside encounters, James felt the larger truth. The Red Ball Express was not only fueling tanks, it was fueling hearts. Gunfire cracks from a lonely farmhouse wall. The rain had been falling all afternoon, the kind that seeps into boots and clings to uniforms until every step feels heavier than the last. The convoy pushed through the sodden countryside with engines groaning, tires sending arcs of mud skyward. James gripped the wheel, his eyes fixed on the faint cat eyes ahead. Davis, hunched in the passenger seat, muttered about the storm, about how even the weather seemed determined to slow them. By early evening, the convoy approached a crossroads. It looked like any other, a narrow track lined with hedgerows, a farmhouse squatting at the edge of a field, its roof sagging under the weight of rain. Nothing about it seemed unusual. Then, just as the lead truck nosed into the junction, the air split with the jagged roar of an MG-42. Bullets screamed across the road, shattering the stillness. The convoy shuddered to a halt. Drivers threw themselves from cabs, seeking cover behind fenders and wheels. James slammed the brake, the Jimmy skidding slightly in the mud, and pulled Davis down with him as glass burst from the windshield. The farmhouse windows spat fire. The chatter of machine guns was relentless. the distinctive tearing sound unmistakable. German rifles cracked from the shadows. The quiet, rain-soaked evening had turned, in an instant, into chaos. James's heart hammered in his chest. His hands fumbled for the carbine by his seat. Beside him, Davis cursed softly, his face pale in the dim light. Around them, shouts rang out. Orders barked, drivers calling to each other, the sickening cry of a man struck by gunfire. They were truckers, not soldiers. Their weapons training was basic, their rifles little more than reassurance. Yet now they crouched in the mud, returning fire toward dark windows, their rounds swallowed by rain and plaster. Minutes dragged like hours. The Germans fired in bursts, forcing the convoy to stay pinned. James pressed against the Jimmy's wheel, his cheek wet with rain and sweat. He dared a glance over the hood. The farmhouse loomed, its walls pocked with fresh holes, smoke curling from one broken shutter. He fired a shot without thinking, the recoil jarring his shoulder. "Hold on," Davis muttered. "They'll send help." They have to. And help did come, but not in the form James expected. The sound reached them first. Deep, growling engines, unmistakable even through the storm. From the eastern road, 2 Sherman tanks rumbled into view, their hulls slick with rain, their commanders scanning the field. Relief coursed through the convoy like electricity. The tanks rolled forward, machine guns already barking. The farmhouse shuddered under the barrage, chunks of stone flying. Then came the heavy boom of a 75mm cannon. The shell slammed into the wall, sending debris into the field. A second shot followed, then a third, until the building's roof sagged inward. Silence fell suddenly, unnerving after the fury of noise. Rain pattered on mud and steel. Smoke drifted from the broken farmhouse. Then, from the wreckage, figures emerged. 3 Germans, their hands raised, their helmets gone. They staggered forward, water streaming down their faces. Prisoners now, their fight finished. James lowered his rifle slowly, his breath ragged. He felt no triumph, only exhaustion and the hollow ache of survival. Around him, drivers emerged from cover, muddy and shaken. One man clutched his arm, blood darkening his sleeve, but he waved away help. "It's just a scratch," he insisted. The convoy commander strode past, shouting for trucks to reform. "We've lost enough time. Move out as soon as the tanks clear the road." His voice carried the tone of necessity, of duty outweighing fear. James climbed back into the cab, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. The windshield was a jagged mess, shards glittering on the floor. Davis slid in beside him, his jaw tight. Neither spoke for a long time. The tanks moved ahead, their hulking silhouettes leading the way, and the convoy rolled on once more. Only when the farmhouse disappeared into the mist behind them did James allow himself to exhale fully. He thought of the Germans inside, young, filthy, their eyes hollow. Not fanatics, perhaps, just soldiers stranded in a retreat, clinging to orders that no longer mattered. Davis broke the silence. "They could have stopped us cold. Could have burned half these trucks if they'd wanted." James nodded, his throat dry. "But they didn't. Not all the way." The road stretched on, slick with rain, bordered by fields scarred from battle. The convoy's rhythm returned, engines humming, wheels splashing through puddles. Yet the memory of the farmhouse clung to James, sharper than the gunfire itself. He had seen how quickly routine could unravel, how fragile the lifeline truly was. That night, when the convoy halted at a supply point, the drivers spoke in hushed tones. Some cursed the Germans, others praised the tanks. A few fell silent, staring into cups of coffee gone cold, their thoughts elsewhere James sat with Davis near the truck, the rain easing at last into a drizzle. Davis lit a cigarette, shielding the flame from the wind. He took a drag, exhaled, then said quietly, "I don't think we'll forget this one." James agreed. Some convoys blurred together, miles of road indistinguishable from the last, but the farmhouse in the rain, the crack of gunfire, the sudden roar of tanks, that would linger. It was the kind of memory that crawled into dreams, surfacing in the still hours of night. Yet even in its shadow, the convoy rolled on. The Red Ball Express had no room for pause, no space for reflection. Tomorrow would bring another road, another bridge, another challenge. The farmhouse became part of the long chain of trials, another link in the lifeline that had to hold, no matter the cost. Trucks returned carrying broken bodies and hope. The Red Ball Express had always been about supplies moving forward. Gasoline in jerry cans, boxes of K-rations, crates of artillery shells stacked to the roof. But the road was not a one-way line. The trucks that thundered toward the front came back just as heavy, though their cargo was of a different sort. Some carried empty containers, twisted equipment, or spent shell casings. Others carried something far more fragile, the wounded. James remembered the first time his truck was flagged down at a supply point, not to be loaded with fuel or ammunition, but with men. Stretchers appeared, carried by medics moving with quiet urgency. "You've got space," the sergeant said. It wasn't a request. James and Davis jumped down, clearing the bed, tightening straps, making room. Soon the back of the Jimmy was lined with stretchers, each one bearing a soldier. Bandages wrapped around arms, torsos, eyes. Some men were silent, staring into nothing. Others moaned softly, the sound mingling with the patter of rain on canvas. One clutched at James's sleeve as he adjusted the straps, whispering through cracked lips, "We pushing them back?" "Yes," James said, though he didn't know for sure. "We're pushing them back." The man nodded faintly, then closed his eyes. Driving with fuel felt heavy, dangerous, but driving with men, broken, bleeding, dependent, was something else entirely. Every bump in the road felt like a betrayal. James slowed at ruts, eased over potholes, gritted his teeth when the truck jolted despite his care. In the rear, the wounded stirred and muttered. Davis, riding in back on one run, sat cross-legged between stretchers, murmuring reassurances that sounded like prayers. The convoy didn't pause. Regulations demanded the same spacing, the same speed. "Cargo is cargo," one officer had said, but for the drivers, it wasn't the same. The knowledge of who rode behind them settled like a weight on their shoulders. The smell was different too. Instead of fuel fumes or the tang of cordite, there was the copper bite of blood, the acrid sting of antiseptic, the earthy odor of sweat and bandages soaked through. In the dim light of blackout runs, James sometimes imagined he could feel their breath behind him, faint currents of life riding on every mile. One night, the convoy halted unexpectedly. Word passed back, mines on the road ahead. The column sat in silence while engineers probed the earth with rods, their shadows flickering in lantern light. In the truck bed, a wounded man groaned, his voice low. Davis leaned close, wiping the man's brow with a rag dipped in canteen water. "You'll make it," he whispered, though the man's eyes told another story. Hours later, as they rolled on, James kept glancing into the rear view, though the canvas cover hid everything. He could not shake the sense that the truck itself had become a ward, a fragile ambulance carrying hope through mud and fear. At supply dumps farther back, the wounded were offloaded with brisk efficiency. Medics and stretcher bearers swept in, their hands practiced, their eyes tired. Drivers were waved away quickly. New loads awaited, schedules pressed. But James always lingered a moment, watching the stretchers disappear into field hospitals, watching the thin line between survival and loss play out in hurried footsteps. Sometimes men spoke. One told James about his farm in Iowa, about corn rows stretching farther than the eye could see. Another murmured his mother's name over and over, as if repetition could summon her. Some said nothing at all. Their silence was louder than words. The drivers learned not to ask names, not to press for stories. The road demanded distance, demanded focus. Yet in quiet moments, under a tarp during rain, by the glow of a cigarette at midnight, James and Davis would recall faces, not as statistics, but as passengers who had trusted their rough, battered truck to carry them one step closer to safety. The Red Ball Express became, in these moments, more than supply. It was a bridge for the living, a ferry for the broken, and sometimes, when the canvas was drawn back at journey's end, a stretcher would not move. Medics would work silently, covering the body with a blanket, sliding it away while drivers looked down at their boots. James never grew used to that. He carried those memories with him like extra cargo, invisible but weighty. One evening, as the convoy prepared to leave with another load of wounded, Davis caught James's eye. Strange thing, isn't it? We started out hauling gas. Now we're hauling men. James nodded slowly. And maybe that matters more. The engines roared, the trucks lurched forward, and the convoy rolled into the night once again, bearing not just supplies, but the fragile threads of lives clinging to tomorrow. Life narrows to road, load, and return. By the fourth week of running the Red Ball Express, James no longer measured life in days. The calendar had ceased to matter. Instead, he thought in terms of convoys. One run forward, one run back, and then another sleep came in fragments. Meals blurred together, always eaten too quickly or too late. The world shrank until it felt as if his entire existence was bounded by the truck's cab, the ribbon of road before him, and the weight of the cargo behind. Morning and night were indistinguishable on blackout runs. Time was marked not by sunrise or sunset, but by the creak of canvas flaps, the bark of orders, the cough of engines forced to life in damp air. James sometimes caught himself staring blankly at the road, unable to recall whether it was Tuesday or Friday, August or September. What he knew, what every driver knew, was distance. 50 miles forward, 60 back, 200 more tomorrow. The truck itself had become almost an extension of his body. He knew every sound of the Jimmy's engine, could sense by the faintest change in vibration when something was wrong. The steering wheel rubbed a permanent callus into the heel of his palm. The seat, though hard, molded to the shape of his frame. Sometimes, in the silence between conversations, James felt as if he was less a man and more a component of the machine, a driver-shaped gear turning endlessly in the convoy's great, grinding rhythm. Davis joked about it. We're ghosts now. Nothing but shadows tied to these trucks. His laugh was hollow, but his eyes were steady. He was right in a way. Their lives no longer resembled anything of the civilian world. James's memories of Cleveland, the gas station, the chatter of customers, the smell of gasoline and fresh bread from the bakery down the block, felt like someone else's life. The present was a different reality. Mud, diesel, dust, and the ceaseless demand to keep moving. Even conversations narrowed. The men talked about the road, about the loads they hauled, about breakdowns and repairs. Rarely did they speak of home, except in passing. Home belonged to a distant place beyond the horizon, one they dared not picture too clearly. It hurt too much. Instead, they clung to the practical. Fan belts fraying. Bridge out ahead. 50 more miles. These became the vocabulary of survival. And yet, within that narrow world, small rituals sprouted. James and Davis rotated seats with almost ceremonial precision. At each refueling point, Davis always checked the oil while James inspected the tires. At night, James lit a stub of candle in the cab before rolling out, a habit he couldn't explain, except that it made the darkness feel less vast for a moment. Davis teased him for it, but never asked him to stop. The food was always the same: cold beans, hard biscuits, bitter coffee strong enough to strip paint. But the drivers joked about it, creating elaborate fantasies of feasts waiting for them at the end of the road. "A steak so big you can't see the plate," one man would say. Another added, "Pie taller than your head." The laughter was quiet, but it stitched them together. Exhaustion blurred the edges of everything. There were times James thought he heard voices in the rumble of the engine, whispers woven into the mechanical drone. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, wondering if sleep deprivation had finally begun to pull tricks. Other drivers admitted the same. One swore he saw a line of headlights where no trucks were. Another claimed he smelled his mother's cooking drifting through the cab. They all laughed about it in the daylight, but at night, when the fog pressed close, the line between real and imagined wavered. Still, the trucks rolled. Day after day, night after night, they carried their burdens through forests and fields, across ruined bridges and shell-pocked roads. Each run was another bead on a string, indistinguishable from the last but essential to the whole. One evening, as they sat at a refueling point, Davis leaned back against the wheel and said, "Think about it. This is history, right here. And all anyone will remember is the battles." James looked at him, weary but thoughtful. "Maybe. But they'll never win those battles if we don't keep these trucks moving." That was the truth of it, plain and hard. The drivers were invisible, tucked into the background of the war, but without them, the guns would fall silent, the tanks would stall, the infantry would go hungry. Their narrow world was, in truth, a bridge holding up the wide one. James found comfort in that, even as the routine pressed down. The road stretched on endlessly, and the cargo shifted from fuel to food to men. But the duty remained unchanged: drive, deliver, return, over and over. Frost marks the last run of the convoy. The mornings had changed. Gone were the damp green fields of late summer, the buzzing flies, and the smell of dust baked into uniforms. Now the world woke beneath a veil of frost. Each blade of grass glittered silver in the weak November light, and the ground crunched beneath boots that were stiff from the cold. The air felt sharper, slicing into lungs with every breath. James cupped his hands around a dented tin of coffee, steam rising like fragile smoke into the still air. This morning was different, not just because of the frost. It carried a quiet significance, whispered through the camp the night before. This would be the final run. The Red Ball Express, after nearly 3 months of grinding urgency, was winding down. The railways had been repaired. The port at Antwerp was open. Pipelines now stretched deep into Europe. The lifeline of trucks had done its job. James sat in the cab of his Jimmy, the same one he'd driven since England. The seat bore the imprint of his frame. The wheel was worn smooth where his hands had gripped it for thousands of miles. The truck had carried gasoline, food, ammunition, broken equipment, and wounded men. It had rattled over bomb craters, crept across temporary bridges, and endured rainstorms that turned roads into rivers. Now, it was ready for one more journey. Davis climbed in, rubbing his gloved hands together. cold enough to freeze the gas in the tank," he muttered. His breath hung white in the cab. He set his coffee aside and leaned his head back against the seat. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken knowledge that this was the end of something vast. The convoy formed up slowly, fewer trucks than in those frantic early days. Engines coughed awake, exhaust drifting in pale clouds. The drivers moved with the stiffness of men who had lived too long in the rhythm of load and return. Even their banter was subdued, voices muffled under scarves. Yet beneath the quiet ran a current of pride, the recognition that they had kept the lifeline alive until other systems could take its place. As the flag dropped, the line of trucks rolled forward, tires crunching on frozen mud. The roads, improved by weeks of use and repair, were easier now, though slick with ice in shaded patches. James drove carefully, hands steady on the wheel, eyes scanning for black ice that might send the Jimmy sliding. The frost made everything sharper, the edges of fields, the skeletons of trees stripped bare, the breath of cattle huddled near barns. Davis broke the silence with a low chuckle. "Remember the first time you ground the gears on this beast? Thought the sergeant would skin you alive." James smiled faintly. "Feels like years ago." "Feels like another life," Davis corrected. They passed villages where life was tentatively returning. Farmers in patched coats worked fields, smoke curled from chimneys, children kicked at piles of frozen leaves. In one town, women hung laundry that froze stiff in the morning air, shirts standing almost upright on the line. Some waved as the convoy passed, though fewer than before. The novelty of trucks had given way to the steady march of rebuilding. Still, each wave felt like a farewell. At midday, the convoy halted at a refueling station, one that had been there since the earliest days. The sergeant in charge, wrapped in a thick coat, greeted James with a grin. "Heard this is your last run. Hell of a thing you boys did. 12,000 tons a day, 400,000 in all. Never been done before." He slapped the side of James's truck with admiration. "And never will again, I wager." James nodded, humbled. Numbers had never meant much to him. It was the faces along the road, the wounded in the back, the mud that swallowed tires, the flowers tossed from windows that lingered in his memory. But hearing the scale spoken aloud filled him with a quiet awe. They had been part of something larger than themselves, something history would remember. The cargo this time was different. Crates of winter clothing and medical supplies, coats, gloves, boots, morphine. Not as dramatic as gasoline or shells, but no less vital with winter pressing in. James thought of soldiers in foxholes, shivering in snow, and pressed the accelerator a little harder. As afternoon faded into dusk, the sky deepened to violet. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the road. The convoy pressed on, headlights hooded, the familiar discipline of spacing maintained to the end. The trucks hummed like a single organism, their rhythm unbroken even now. Davis watched the sky darken. "Strange, isn't it? To think tomorrow we won't be out here." James nodded. He couldn't quite imagine it. The absence of the road, the silence where engines should roar, the pause in a routine that had consumed his very being. They reached their destination just after nightfall, a supply depot near the Belgian border. Permanent buildings had replaced tents, lights glowed steadily, and the air carried the hum of an organized system settling into permanence. The urgency that had defined the Red Ball was gone, replaced by order. As their cargo was unloaded, James and Davis climbed down stiffly, watching the crates disappear into warehouses. No fanfare greeted them, no speeches, no celebrations. just the steady work of war continuing in another form. Yet that was fitting. The Red Ball Express had never been about glory. It had always been about necessity. Later, back at camp, Sergeant Harris sought them out. Clipboard in hand, his face stern as ever, he delivered their new orders. They were being reassigned to another transportation company, supporting the 9th Army near the German border. "Good duty," he said gruffly. "Not like this circus." Then, almost awkwardly, he extended his hand. "Best damn drivers I had." James shook it, surprised by the rare warmth in the sergeant's eyes. Davis followed, and for a moment, the bond of shared miles was acknowledged openly. That night, the drivers gathered in a mess tent for one final meal together. The air was thick with smoke and laughter, subdued but genuine. Men swapped addresses, promised to write, spoke of returning home, of what they might do after. One dreamed of running his own trucking company. Another swore he'd never touch a steering wheel again. James and Davis sat quietly, listening, their own thoughts drifting between relief and melancholy. When the captain stood to address them, his voice carried across the tent with simple honesty. He spoke of the tonnage moved, the obstacles overcome, the endurance shown. "When the history of this war is written," he said, "the Red Ball Express will stand as one of its great achievements." He raised his cup to the Red Ball. The men echoed him softly, their cups lifted high. Later, walking back to their tent beneath a sky thick with stars, James felt the frost crunch underfoot and the cold air burn his lungs. Davis tucked his scarf tighter and said, 82 days. Feels like years." James nodded. The frost glimmered faintly on the trucks parked nearby, each one a monument to miles traveled and burdens carried. Tomorrow, the Red Ball would end. Tonight, it lived still, in the hearts of men who had kept it alive. Farewell fades into dreams of endless roads. Morning arrived pale and still, the canvas of the tents stiff with frost, edges rimmed white as if winter's hand had traced them during the night. James woke to the muffled sounds of men packing, boots thudding softly, duffel bags being slung over shoulders. This was not the usual scramble of a convoy preparing to move out. There was no whistle shrill enough to jolt them into their routine. Instead, there was a slower rhythm, a quiet acknowledgement that the Red Ball Express had reached its final chapter. James sat on his cot for a moment, rubbing his eyes, letting the cool air sting his face awake. His duffel bag was already packed, his possessions few. Worn uniforms, a shaving kit, letters creased from too much folding, and a small wrench he kept as a talisman from the first day he'd learned to double-clutch the jimmy. Davis was already outside, stamping his feet against the cold, steam rising from his breath. The camp itself looked unchanged. Rows of trucks, tents pitched on muddy ground, the faint smell of diesel in the air. Yet the energy was different. Where once there had been urgency and tension, now there was reflection, even melancholy. The Red Ball was ending, not with fanfare or parades, but with the quiet dispersal of men and machines, as if the road itself was releasing them. At the marshalling area, a transport truck waited to carry James, Davis, and a handful of others to their next assignments. Its engine idled with a deep, steady hum, canvas flapping gently in the cold breeze. James's eyes drifted to his Jimmy, parked nearby. Another driver, a boy with a face too fresh for the lines of exhaustion James knew so well, was checking the tires, testing the clutch, running his hand along the wheel as if trying to learn its secrets by touch. James walked over, resting his hand on the truck's fender. "She pulls a little to the right when you brake," he said softly. The young driver looked up quickly, nodding with earnest seriousness. "Anything else I should know?" he asked. James wanted to tell him everything, that the windshield fogged easily in rain, that the wipers slowed under strain, that the seat was unforgiving after 12 hours. He wanted to tell him about the stretches of road where the engine's growl became a companion, about the times the headlights ahead disappeared and his chest tightened, about the sound of wounded men breathing in the back on nights when silence pressed heavier than gunfire. But he said none of that. He only gave the fender one last pat and said, "Take care of her. She's a good truck." The boy nodded again, eyes wide, as if understanding something beyond the words. James turned and walked toward the transport. Davis was already climbing aboard, giving him a small grin. "Didn't think you'd let her go so easy," Davis said as James pulled himself up beside him. "Wasn't easy," James admitted. The transport rolled out, its wooden benches hard beneath them, canvas rattling in the wind. Behind them, the rows of red ball trucks receded slowly, their shapes fading into the pale morning light. James watched until they were no longer visible, until only the frost on the fields and the breath of cattle marked the landscape. The road stretched ahead, though it was no longer the frantic artery of supply it had once been. Now it was just another road, carrying them east toward Belgium, toward new assignments, toward an uncertain end to a long war. Yet in James's mind, the road behind loomed larger. The endless miles driven, the mud that clung to wheels, the blackout lights that guided him through nights so dark he wondered if dawn would ever come. Beside him, Davis dozed, his head bobbing with the rhythm of the truck. James envied his friend's ability to find sleep anywhere. For himself, he simply leaned back, letting the motion carry him, his thoughts drifting. Faces came to him unbidden, the farmers waving from doorways, the children chasing trucks for gum, the wounded soldier whispering, "Are we pushing them back?" With only one eye open, he thought of the bridge that cracked under his wheels, of the farmhouse that spat fire, of the long nights when the rain refused to stop. All of it blurred together into one endless road, one unbroken memory. At a stop along the way, James climbed down to stretch his legs. The cold air bit his skin, but the horizon was clear, the sky a sharp blue. He realized then that the Red Ball Express, though ending, would never truly leave him. It had shaped him, pressed its mark deep into his bones. He was no longer the boy from Cleveland who pumped gas at his uncle's station. He was a driver, a link in a great chain, a witness to history moving on wheels. When they reached their new camp that evening, James knew life would change again. New trucks, new roads, new duties. But that night, lying in a tent warmed faintly by a coal stove, he dreamed not of the future, but of the convoy. He dreamed of cat-eye lights glowing faintly ahead, of engines rumbling in unison, of the steady pull of the wheel beneath his hands. And in that dream, the road stretched on without end, always leading east, always carrying supplies, always binding together the men who had driven it. Roads. Then, roads now. The roads of 1944 were fragile things, never meant to bear the weight of a war. They twisted through farmlands, cut across valleys, and disappeared into forests where rain turned dirt into soup. For James and the men of the Red Ball Express, every mile was uncertain. A sudden washout could turn a straight stretch into hours of backtracking. A wooden bridge might hold one truck, then crumble under the next. A stretch of narrow lane could mean white knuckles on the wheel, praying that the convoy coming in the opposite direction would not force both drivers into ditches. Back then, every road was a gamble, and the gamble was paid in time, sweat, and sometimes in lives. Yet the men pressed on, engines growling, headlights hooded, trusting in little more than their training and the dim glow of the truck ahead. The road was not simply a surface of dirt and stone. It was the thread that bound the war together. Without it, no advance could move forward. Today, roads have become so natural to us that we rarely pause to notice them. They are wide, layered with asphalt that resists storms, lined with reflective paint that catches even the weakest light. At night, street lamps and guardrails give assurance that each mile has been measured and mapped. Bridges now span rivers in graceful arcs of steel and concrete, engineered to last for decades. Where a red ball convoy once crawled over planks laid by hand, a modern truck can cross a multi-lane overpass without slowing, music playing softly from the radio. It is a change so great it feels like two different worlds. And yet, when you quiet the mind, there are echoes. The hum of tires on pavement is not so different from the rumble of rubber on gravel. The long, steady gaze of a driver into the dark, mile after mile, has not changed. Whether the load is fuel for Patton's tanks or fruit for a supermarket, the act of carrying life forward remains. Imagine James in his Jimmy truck, squinting through fog, cat-eye lights barely visible. His hands were calloused, his body stiff, his spirit stretched thin. Now picture a driver today, leaning back in a padded seat, hands wrapped around a heated steering wheel, GPS glowing softly on the dashboard. One man watched for ambushes in the night. The other glances at traffic alerts on a glowing screen. Worlds apart, and yet both are joined by the same unbroken line of the road. The Red Ball Express was a desperate invention, born because railroads lay shattered and ports could not keep up. Trucks had to do what trains and ships could not. Today, we build with foresight. Logistics is mapped years ahead, ports designed for staggering volumes, highways layered with safety sensors. Still, the lesson of those days lingers. The strength of a society is measured not only in battles fought, but in whether its roads can carry what its people need. Think of the old roads, mud sucking at tires, engineers laying timbers in pouring rain, men pushing wheels by hand to free them from ditches. Now think of modern interstates, lanes stretching clear across mountains, tunnels carved through rock, traffic flowing like rivers of light seen from the sky. One was survival, the other is convenience. Yet both are reminders of human will, the determination to connect, to keep life moving forward. There is tenderness in this comparison. In 1944, a driver could not be certain he would reach the end of his journey. Today, we complain if construction adds 15 minutes to our trip. But perhaps the memory of the red ball should soften our impatience. To remember that not long ago, men risked everything just to keep supplies rolling, just to make sure bread reached tables and fuel reached engines. When you drive today, notice the quiet luxury of certainty. The painted lines, the reliable bridges, the service stations where warm drinks wait. Each is a distant descendant of those muddy tracks across Normandy, a tribute written not in stone, but in asphalt. The road remains what it always was, a lifeline. Then it was a lifeline for armies. Now it is a lifeline for families, for workers, for travelers chasing sunsets. The surface has changed, but the meaning has not. It carries us from one moment of our lives to the next, from memory to possibility. Food, then food now. Back in 1944, food for a soldier was never about pleasure. It was about calories, about keeping the body moving through mud and exhaustion. The Red Ball Express drivers woke to the smell of burnt coffee, to powdered eggs that never quite tasted like eggs, to bread that went stale before the second bite. Sometimes the meal was a tin of beans eaten on the hood of a truck, sometimes a cold K-ration swallowed in the rain. Men joked about it, cursed it, and yet consumed every bite, because hunger left no room for complaint. Food then was rationed, packed, calculated. Every can, every packet was part of a vast equation of survival. A convoy might carry crates of ammunition one way and return with sacks of potatoes or barrels of flour. Drivers knew that behind every crate of rations was an army waiting, thousands of mouths that needed feeding daily. It was not glamorous, but it was essential. Food was fuel, just as gasoline was. Today, food surrounds us in abundance. Step into a grocery store, and you are met with colors that would have startled those men in the 1940s. Pyramids of oranges, cartons of milk kept cold behind glass, aisles stretching with bread still soft and fragrant. Coffee now comes ground or whole, dark roast or light, even flavored with vanilla or hazelnut. No longer a bitter liquid gulped from a dented tin, but a small ritual of choice and comfort. We forget how remarkable this abundance is. Where once James tore open a ration box and found the same crackers for the 10th day in a row, we now pause to decide between 10 different kinds of cereal. Where Davis might have shared a single chocolate bar with his friend under blackout skies, today candy waits at every checkout line, wrapped in bright paper, offered without thought. It is not just the food itself, but the certainty of it. During the Red Ball days, convoys carried bread and meat as if each delivery was a triumph against scarcity. A delay of a day could mean soldiers going hungry at the front. Today, trucks still deliver, grocery shelves are stocked each dawn, but the system has grown so reliable that we barely notice. Supply chains stretch across oceans, coordinated by satellites, cooled by refrigeration units that hum softly as they cross highways. Think of the contrast. A driver in 1944 biting into a can of cold stew. The grease hardened, eating quickly because artillery rumbled in the distance. Now think of a family sitting in a warm kitchen, the table set with fresh vegetables, bread still steaming from the oven, and perhaps a pie cooling on the sill. It is easy to forget that only a few generations separate those two images. Even the rituals of food are different. In camp, meals were hurried, often standing. Coffee was swallowed not for flavor, but for the jolt that kept eyelids open on the night road. Today, coffee shops invite us to linger, to sip slowly while music plays, to treat a drink as a small luxury. What was once medicine for fatigue has become part of daily comfort. Yet in both times, food carried meaning beyond sustenance. For the drivers, a hot meal after days of rain was a reminder that someone cared enough to cook, to ladle soup into battered tins. For us, food still gathers us together. Families around a table, friends meeting for dinner, couples sharing bread. It is still the same gesture, nourishment of body and spirit. Perhaps that is the lesson. The Red Ball Express showed how fragile supply could be, how easily hunger might return if roads failed or convoys faltered. Today's abundance should be met with gratitude, not assumption. Every apple in a basket, every loaf of bread, has traveled its own journey, carried on modern convoys across bridges and through storms, just as supplies once rattled across Normandy. When you lift a fork, think of the men who ate from tins by lantern light, grateful for any bite. When you shop in aisles glowing with plenty, remember how narrow the margin once was, and how the steady hum of trucks, then and now, ensures that hunger stays at bay. Trucks then, trucks now. In 1944, a truck was a stubborn living thing. The GMC Jimmy of the Red Ball Express weighed 5 tons empty and fought every inch of the way. Its engine growled with only 104 horsepower. Its transmission demanded double clutching, and every gear shift felt like an argument between man and machine. A driver had to lean his whole body into the wheel, his arms stiff from hours of wrestling with vibrations, his ears tuned for the faintest rattle that might warn of trouble ahead. The truck was both enemy and companion. James learned its moods, its coughs, its complaints. Davis kept a rag tucked into his belt to wipe grease from his fingers after roadside repairs. When a tire blew in the rain, there was no calling for help, only shoulders pressed into mud, jacks hauled into place, and curses whispered into the night. The truck could betray them at any moment, but it also carried them through storms, across rivers, through fields littered with shell craters. It was rough, imperfect, but it was lifeline. Compare that to trucks today. Step into the cab of a modern 18-wheeler, and you step into something closer to a quiet office than a battlefield mule. The steering wheel turns with ease, guided by power systems that respond with the lightest touch. The seat is cushioned, sometimes even heated, with controls that adjust for comfort. GPS glows on the dash, offering turn-by-turn directions. The engine, once a roaring beast, is now a steady hum beneath insulation, delivering hundreds of horsepower with surprising grace. Where James peered into darkness, guided only by cat-eye lights, today's driver flips on high beams that slice through fog, aided by sensors that warn of lane drift, by radar that watches the road ahead. Where Davis carried a rifle on the seat beside him, a modern driver carries a phone, able to call for roadside assistance within minutes if trouble appears. Even the loads are safer now, strapped with precision, tracked by computers that monitor weight and location. Yet, beneath the differences, there is continuity. A driver still listens for changes in sound, still feels the weight of cargo in each curve. A driver still wakes before dawn, climbs into a cab, and sets off toward a horizon that may take days to reach. The machines have grown smoother, the journey more predictable, but the soul of trucking, the patience, the solitude, the endurance, remains the same. Think of how fragile it was in 1944. A convoy might stop for hours because one truck broke down, engineers scrambling to patch a tie rod or replace a fan belt. Today, fleets are maintained with precision schedules, parts shipped overnight, engines scanned by computers that diagnose problems before they happen. What once took sweat and improvisation now takes planning and technology. And yet, there is a certain tenderness in remembering the old ways. A driver then knew every bolt by touch, could repair a carburetor with his own hands, could coax life back into an engine with nothing more than grit and a wrench. A driver today may not need those skills, but perhaps something has been lost in the ease. James's Jimmy truck strained on hills, its gears grinding, its wheels slipping in mud. But when it reached the top, when the convoy rolled forward again, there was a satisfaction no machine could take away. A sense that man and truck had wrestled the earth together and won. Today, the climb is smoother, the engine stronger, but the intimacy is thinner. Machines carry more of the burden, leaving the driver as a guide rather than a partner. Still, in both eras, trucks carry life. Then, it was gasoline in jerry cans, crates of rations, wounded men lying silent in the back. Now, it may be refrigerated trailers filled with fruit, electronics wrapped in plastic, medicine bound for hospitals. The weight changes, the road changes, but the meaning does not. To drive a truck is to be a quiet thread in the fabric of survival. When you pass a semi on the highway today, remember the Jimmy trucks bouncing over cratered roads in France. Remember that behind the ease of modern engines lies a history of men hunched over stubborn gears, sweat on their brows, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Our smooth rides are built on their rough ones. Drivers. Then, drivers. Now. In 1944, the men behind the wheel were barely more than boys. 19, 20 years old, plucked from farms, gas stations, and factory floors, handed the keys to trucks that weighed 5 tons empty. They were soldiers, yet their war was not fought with rifles and grenades, but with gears, fuel, and endless miles of road. James was one of them, eyes still young but shoulders already carrying a nation's burden. Davis was another, cracking small jokes in the rain to make the road feel shorter. Back then, the driver was both warrior and laborer. He wore a uniform that carried little glory. No ribbons for convoys, no parades for delivering rations. His battles were fought against fatigue, against engines that stalled in mud, against fear when artillery echoed too close. The weapon beside him was not always fired, but it was always ready, for the road itself could turn hostile. And through it all, he kept driving, because behind him an army waited, and to stop meant hunger, silence, or defeat. Today, the driver wears no uniform, yet his role is still vital. On highways that stretch across states, truckers sit in cabs equipped with radios, GPS screens, and beds tucked behind the seats. They are older now, often seasoned by years on the road. Some are veterans of other wars, carrying memories of battle while hauling ordinary cargo. Others are simply men and women who chose the life of motion, who find a strange comfort in the hum of tires and the solitude of night driving. The hardships are different, but they remain. Where James once wrestled with fear of ambush, today's driver wrestles with loneliness. Long stretches without family, weeks away from home, meals eaten in diners where the waitress knows their name, but not their story. The dangers are subtler now. Fatigue at the wheel, the sudden swerve of another car, storms that sweep across highways. Yet the endurance is the same. To be a driver, then and now, is to accept hours of silence, to measure time in miles, to carry weight that others never see. In 1944, the drivers were largely unseen. Newspapers wrote of generals, of great offensives, of victories and losses. Few words were spared for the convoys. Today, it is similar. We talk of commerce, of supply chains, of goods arriving just in time. Rarely do we pause to picture the human being who guided that cargo across the night, who adjusted his seat at 2 a.m. and took another sip of coffee to stay awake. Yet without them, the system collapses. Then, it was armies stalling for lack of fuel. Now, it would be grocery shelves standing empty, hospitals waiting for supplies that never come, factories grinding to a halt. The faces change, the uniforms change, but the truth remains. The driver is the hidden heartbeat of movement. Think of James, 19 years old, fingers stiff with cold, boots wet, still coaxing his Jimmy truck forward. And think of a driver today, 50 years old, pausing at a rest stop to stretch his back, adjusting the cap on his head before climbing back into the cab. One carried jerry cans for Patton's tanks. The other carries pallets of produce for city markets. Both, in their time, keep life flowing. The dignity of the role is quiet. Few songs are written for drivers, few monuments raised, but there is something noble in this obscurity. The road does not ask for applause. It asks only for persistence, for one more mile, one more hour, one more delivery. The men of the Red Ball gave that persistence in the mud of France. The drivers of today give it on the endless blacktop of our interstates. And when you see a truck pass you on the highway, headlights steady in the night, think of the boy who once drove through Normandy under blackout skies, Think of the lineage of drivers carrying not only cargo, but the invisible weight of trust, of responsibility, of connection. The faces are different. The burden is the same. Voices then, voices now. In 1944, the world of communication was a fragile thread. For James and the other drivers of the Red Ball Express, news from home came slowly, printed on paper, carried across the ocean, then handed out in stacks at the mail tent. A letter from Cleveland or Oregon was treasure beyond measure. Men unfolded the envelopes with hands calloused from the wheel, breathing in the faint scent of home, still clinging to the paper. They read by lantern light, sometimes aloud to one another, voices quiet in the damp air of canvas tents. To send word back was equally uncertain. A letter might take weeks to arrive, if it arrived at all. There were no guarantees. The post traveled with the tide of war, sometimes delayed by storms, sometimes lost entirely. So a driver wrote carefully, saying less than he felt, keeping his words light to spare his family worry. "I'm fine. I miss your cooking. I'll be home soon." Phrases repeated by thousands of soldiers, as much for themselves as for those waiting back home. On the road, communication was even more fragile. Convoys moved with little more than hand signals, shouted orders, or the whistle of an MP at a crossroads. Radios were scarce, used mainly by command jeeps. If a truck broke down in the dark, the driver's only recourse was to wait, rifle at his side, hoping the next convoy would bring help. Silence was both shield and burden. Every mile was traveled without chatter, without music, without the comfort of a voice on the other end of a line. Today, the world hums with voices. A modern driver climbs into the cab, and before starting the engine, he may call home. He may hear the laughter of children over a video screen, may watch a grandchild show a drawing held up to a camera. He can send a message in seconds, a string of words or even a photograph, crossing oceans in less time than it took James to double clutch from second to third gear. Navigation, too, has changed. James relied on mimeographed sheets with directions, on painted red circles nailed to trees, on memory of curves and villages. Today's driver has satellites in the sky tracing his route, warning him of traffic, offering alternate roads when storms or delays appear. What once required intuition and luck is now displayed on glowing screens, precise down to the minute. It is tempting to see this as pure progress, and in many ways, it is. The fear of silence has been banished. No driver today must sit at the roadside in the dark, wondering if he has been forgotten. No family must wait months for a letter to know their son is alive. Yet in that silence of the past, there was also depth. A single letter was read and reread, until the paper softened at the creases. Words carried weight, because they were rare. Today, words come easily, flowing across screens, often forgotten as quickly as they are sent. Think of James, tucking his mother's letter into his breast pocket, carrying it like a talisman. Each time he touched the paper, he felt less alone. Now think of a driver pulling into a rest stop, scrolling through dozens of messages, replying with a thumbs-up emoji before climbing back behind the wheel. The scale has shifted. What was once precious has become common, though no less important. And yet, the essence is the same. Then and now, a driver still seeks connection, whether by ink on paper or by glowing screen, whether by waiting weeks or by answering instantly, the need is unchanged. To know that someone waits, someone cares, someone will listen. There is a quiet beauty in both eras. In the past, communication was a candle in the dark, fragile but warm. Today, it is a steady lamp, burning brightly, always within reach. Each reflects the human heart's refusal to journey alone. The voices then came slowly, carried on fragile paper. The voices now arrive instantly, glowing on screens, but whether whispered across weeks or spoken across seconds, they remain the same. Reminders that on every road, no one truly drives alone.